Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. And yeah, thanks to Vish for inviting me to write this chapter. And after yesterday's inputs on the various chapters, I'm feeling quite excited about this edition. So my part in the book is going to look at illuminating the paradoxes and I suppose the contradictions in the South African state's energy transitions pathway. So yeah, I guess just 30-second background. So I used to very much be in the social environmental justice space. In fact, I know from the year 2000s around our fights against exploitive mining. It was various communities around Joburg and Mpumalanga. So but I became a jaded activist and I took refuge at the university. And so now I'm based at the University of Cape Town and working on this Transnational Center for Just Transitions, long name, energy, and climate and sustainability. It's called TRAJEX. And it's based at the Energy Systems Research Group in the Chemical Engineering Department. So I feel a bit displaced at the moment, being an interdisciplinary scholar. Nevertheless, my pictures there around the transition, these photos, well, these three I took by myself. This comes from the internet. That is a coal mine in eMagaghleni. And you see the railway line, that railway line goes to Richards Bay. And so, and I think that's actually Kendall coal mine. You can see the pollution coal power station in Mpumalanga, in eMagaghleni. But yeah, as you know, the world is in this transition to move out of fossil fuel dependency into renewable energies as a response, as one of the key responses to climate change. So I'm going to use a framework or conceptual thinking based on cheap energy. And this notion of cheapness comes from a scholar called Jason Moore. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's also quite well known for saying that our problem or our challenge in the world today is not so much the Anthropocene, we're not in the age of human, but it's the Capitalocene. So it's the capitalist social relations that over 500 years of exploitation has caused planetary ecology change and has, remade the planet with our extreme weather conditions. So he has this notion of that the capital over 500 years has accumulated with the four cheaps. So I'm going to try for like cheap labor, cheap food, cheap energy. I forget the fourth one. But this cheapness is also extended to cheap money. And cheapness is not so much in terms of price, that we know that it's cheap when we get a bargain. It's more in terms of an extractive relationship. So in order for capital to accumulate, it is at the expense of other humans, human natures, and nature. So capital, the extension of accumulation, can't really happen, if it was done differently. And I'm going to speak about non-capitalist relationships later. But the strategy of cheapness and profits, Raj Patel and Jason Moore says, is a practice of violence that mobilizes all kinds of work, including human. So we know that cheap labor is critical, and Marx has explained the appropriation of labor in capital accumulation, but also the exploitation of non-humans, animals, plants, geology, minerals, with as little compensation as possible. So my concern is that the discourse in energy transitions and the sort of climate mitigation realm, there's very little focus on this productivist model of how capital accumulates. So, and that is in a relationship, and that relationship, I said that is always at the expense of other humans and the non-human world. And then the other aspect is that there's very little thinking around the notion of the resource logic. And so nature is here and the land is here. It's not something that you can produce, but land became a resource under the realms of enclosures and properties, or private property. Yesterday was it Zara that spoke about this philosopher, Cartesian, Descartes, and very much this notion of the resource logic comes from seeing nature as things to be extracted. So, and seeing things as units to be extracted. And so I'm, in my thesis, is questioning the productivist and resource logic. And yes, so I'm saying that, I'm concerned that little attention is paid to the framing of the climate crisis beyond the realms of economic production and endless human use. But I just want to clarify human use, because not all humans have benefited. Many humans have suffered and continue to suffer from the system. So I borrow from Sylvia Winter, who describes the sort of human as a human that sees himself mostly as masters of nature, so human mastery, and a human that can dominate the natural world. And so she defines this human as being human is purely biocentric, in biocentric terms of the present global globally hegemonic, a mono-humanist, a secular Western human that is no less generous specific, and now is the neoliberal conception of man. So this version of the human is a heteropatriarchal human. It's a human that sees, whiteness as supreme, and that maintains the colonial social orders of class divides, race divides, gender discrimination. And so I'm not a fan of the term the Anthropocene. So, and if I were to use the Anthropocene, it would be specifically explaining a particular type of human, because the Aborigines and the Khoikhoi and other humans had a more relational connection to the earth, is certainly not to blame. So yeah, and just to say, the Anthropocene discourse also ignores and overlooks a whole range of other relationships of other ways of being, ecological, spiritual, cultural. So I just want to situate, I guess, where I'm coming from in the approach to the chapter. So my inquiry, not trip over, looks at, okay, you can read along. Yeah, our South African electricity parastatal, Eskom, we all know it too well, and how it has become a corporatized entity. It looks at how electricity has become commodified in South Africa, although, the commodity of electricity and health and education is part of the wave of globalization. And it also looks at the fault lines of the current international climate policy demands to reduce electricity generation dependence from coal. So in a sense, it illuminates the paradox of this investment growth-driven paradigm in renewable energy transition. So we see this wave of, particularly in South Africa, of these big corporate investments in wind and solar. And now there's also this big wave around hydrogen energy. So I show basically how the state's energy transitions pathways and its development aspirations around green growth, or the terms that they use, a low carbon economy, is entangled in imperial agendas that require and seek new frontiers to stimulate capital accumulation. And now they use this terms just transitions, which is very controversial in a sense of, one has to ask, can you have justice in a system that perpetuates a neoliberal paradigm? So these are some questions that I will, I guess, engage with. How the South Africa's just transitions framework potentially is deceiving the public. Maybe some of you have seen the presidential framework of just transition. Has nice words like redistributive justice, procedural justice, and others. Like what it overlooks, what it entrenches, and what are the implications for the earth and those in daily struggle. So and I guess when I say the earth, it's for all life. Okay, so basically I argue that while South African government gestures towards just transitions, these energy transitions are premised on a nature-society binary of separation that separates the direct producers from earth systems in the means of productions. In other words, just borrow from Seesman and Wenzel, nature is something that is seen seen as stuff that's only available to be sold, used, extracted under the logic of capitalism and a particular type of socialism. And this is now still facilitated under the auspices of cheap nature. So just to say, Jason was written this, it's my favorite book, on the capitalism in the web of life. But he feels that the wave of cheap natures is over because the royal we, the human, extractive human, has extracted already so much from the earth. We've gone through cheap labor. Now, one doesn't even need so many humans because we have all this AI and tech. But I'm wondering, I saw that Vish had the green, did you say the green state? The green state. I'm wondering if the green state is another wave of cheapness. So, we can put all question marks as we venture in this realms. So, so basically I already explained a little bit about cheapness, but he points out that cheap nature is essential for capital accumulation. So this can only be done in an exploitative way for capital to accumulate. So, and he also says this can only be adequately interpreted in a post-Cartesian frame. So not in a way that's either or and separates. We must look at ways of both and we must look at how capital is actually totally independent on nature. I mean, and a range of policies from the state that need to facilitate the ongoingness of cheapness. And the way this has happened is the organization of the enjoining capital, power, and life. And this organization always requires new frontiers. And in fact, Europe's history of colonialism is already, I don't know, in the 1400s or so. They really extracted their soil. I mean, they were in crisis. There was the plague, and part of Europe's strategy to I guess recover or expand was their own internal colonization. So the English and the French, and they were always fighting each other, but also getting on their ships and the external colonization. So they found these other continents and to exploit. So just this last part of frontiers, so it's a way of seeing like new sites for cheapness to be seized, and where cheap work of humans and nature is coerced. So he expands Marxist view on capital accumulation through the exploitation of wage labor, to including how capital appropriates uncommodified humans and non-human natures. And in both in its productivity and its commodity production, which is underpinned by cheapness and profit accumulation. Okay, so now kind of big framing to go into the chapter more deeply. So I do a deep history on the corporatization of Eskom. And a lot of that has been done by David MacDonald in a book called the Electric Capitalism. So, I mean, you can read that. I think it's very important, particularly at this time. And then I show how the interactions between the market-centered neoliberal underpinnings is facilitated by the government to create favorable conditions. And particularly I focus on these independent power producers that has emerged. So key questions are at what cost is the implementation of these public-private partnerships? Also, what are the implications of these presidential climate committee, the PPC framework, in the suit of market-centered neoliberal policies? I really see it's quite impossible to meet procedural justice, reproductive justice in this neoliberal paradigm. And finally, I explore how we might overcome these paradoxes. So, I'm just going to say some of this is from my PhD. When one writes a PhD, you think like, oh my God, how am I going to write 80,000 words? But actually, one has so much. And then, you have to find ways to narrow down. I feel similar with this chapter. Anyway, so I'm going to squiz through this part because I really want to focus on the new imaginaries and ways of thinking differently. But I think it's important to remember, and Siraj did a good job of also explaining financialization and the REAP, this Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program. Now I'm going to say REAP, that is essentially a de-risking project, and the state is creating these favorable conditions, but also guarantees investments. I just want to say a difference between sort of previous investments in sort of state capitalism is that an investor who'd put money into some venture, it might take off or it might not. People would lose a lot of money. But now in this neoliberal and you can put in your money and you guaranteed your profit. And the state has a range of conditions to guarantee that. Now, I just want to emphasize that, and just to remember that Eskom, that before it became with a K, was a public entity by the apartheid government. Electricity was a public good. Electricity mostly went to industrial development, but also to the houses of white people. And so, it was a government that saw itself operate within the public interest, well, albeit skewed to like white South Africans, and many Black South Africans did not have access to electricity or limited. But McDonald's work introduces us to the beginnings of the privatization of energy, but in its narrowest form of introducing independent power producers, the corporatization of services, outsourcing many of the services, and disinvesture of the state into building or maintaining the state entity. So already in the 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, the ANC-led government was already thinking of unbundling Eskom, but this was all halted by the trade unions because they wanted a strong public entity. But now in the year 2024, but already from 2011, we see government implement their plans of unbundling Eskom and separating its generation and there's a new transmission company. So I mean, I don't know where the resistance is, but like, the neoliberal agenda is moving along. The next point I want to put is on pricing. So pricing was another form of neoliberalism, and where when new electricity lines were installed, concepts came in from the World Bank, like user pays, cost recovery. So low incomes were paying higher tariffs so that the cost could be recovered. The other point here is the introduction of the prepaid meters, which in a sense is a self-imposed cutoff, because before the municipality used to cut you off, but then it was too much of a schlep for them to reconnect, and it was easier just to get these water meters. So now people, I mean, then already, and now even more so, many people have to make tragic choices about paying for electricity, paying for food, and electricity, we know, is extremely expensive in South Africa. So yes, I just want to say it's already began a while back, the kind of neoliberal trajectory. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. Gosh, it goes, there's only half an hour that flew. Okay, all right. I told you that the REAP essentially is a de-risking project, and our governments are standing guarantee for these public-private partnerships, and they have arranged that they a contract with Eskom to pay for every megawatt that goes into the central grid. So there's no other, at the moment, ways of thinking through more localized, decentralized ways of energy connections and the grids, although some local governments are thinking about that, but all the electricity from these power producers go into the grid. So I don't know how I'm doing this in 5 minutes, but let me just say that, so basically I also explain the kind of geopolitics and the geopower of the resource logic at play in the REAP. And it's a way of thinking that the South has so much sun and we have so much wind and we must exploit this. Now, while we can't extract the wind and the sun, but the wind and the sun has been carefully measured to be incorporated in the system of capital accumulation through these large scale energy projects. So that's, and Parenti calls this geopower, but the statecraft and technology is very important to make territories visible for investors to come in. And we do that here through our mapping, and much of the wind farms are on land of private farmers, so they're mostly white in this country, and they lease the land, and so they get a revenue on top of their commercial activities. So it's quite easy money. My project here that I worked on is on reclaimed land, and though it seems great on paper, but the material conditions for this community has not changed. Then there's solar farms in the Northern Cape. Again, there's vast amounts of land. Most of it is private, or a lot of it is privately owned. And we have, these big corporations coming in and leasing the land. And and many people living around those areas, they're supposed to benefit within a 50 kilometers radius through some community development, don't have access to electricity. Many of these projects are like social responsibility projects, like a health center. But I want to say a scary part is that many of these communities are so thrilled that these companies are there to help with their school projects and their health projects, because they have been abandoned by government. And so in other countries in South America, many communities are resisting these corporates coming into their land. So that's something to think about. Okay. I now won't go through, but I'm just going to skip through. I have this case study on the Tsitsikamma, and my own work looks at the land and the land history memory. I trace it back to the Khoi before before the colonists came. But also, and I go to the Tsitsikamma and Finger reclaimed this land, but before they removed, they all had their small holdings. You can see it there. And they were removed in 1977. This land became dairy farmland. And when they came back, you can see the dairy farms, but these slides will be available. When people came back, this is small holdings, you can see the small holdings, they thought they were going to come back to farming their land. But what they got was to be placed in the vacant land in RDP houses, and they had to enter into a capitalist relationship. They had to be beneficiaries with the dairy farmers, those who wanted to stay, and now they also offered their land to Synergy, which is Exara's wind farm. I'm sorry, clean energy company. Exara's our second biggest coal company, I think, in South Africa. And they're very much like a philanthropist corporate. But my take-home message here is that the material conditions of the people living there have not changed, nor has the land changed, because this land has been fertilized to death and is contributing also to climate change. But that part often is not considered when we measure the reductions of carbon. Now, this is the part that I'm going to sort of end with, but yeah, I want to say that a lot of our focus also as academics is on this, the top of the rock here in the, wage labor. We're trying to get the state to do the right thing. We're looking at, the productivist market, but how, wage people are being exploited. But we're not looking at what's happening in the cracks and other ways of organizing themselves. I mean, we some of us are, not to say, but it's not in the mainstream. So I like the work of J.K. Gibson Graham because they're interested in community economies and based on non-capitalist relationships. And they are, yesterday we spoke about Ubuntu, ecofeminists came through there. There are a range of relationships that we can work with to think how we organize ourselves differently in all directions: food, our energy needs, and I guess different theories from thinking from the otherwise. So just towards these possibilities, is that the people in the Tsitsikamma, the elderly, are yearning for a relational way, because before they used to cultivate, they had food exchanges, no one went hungry, now they have to go to ShopRite and they need, so we can also learn from the knowledges that have been erased. And then I just ending off now with two, just like examples. We know this, Vish knows, those of you from Cape Town know Vegcorp. But what I want to say is that, the energy is also the energy of what we eat. We need to do a lot of work to return soil life. And so, and these examples are there, and we need the sort of funds that can expand more, polyculture, and then also with citizens, there are examples of communities and workers that have lost their work in the coal mines, but are setting up different projects like solar citizens and where there is, I want to say, just a fair price for people to have access to solar and help pay it back. But also the focus here is not on middle class communities. It is on low income, rural, where here in Australia, local government is supported. And this last example is the Solarities example of the lubricant Cree people that have brought solar and solidarity, and they're thinking much more broader how we think through the social production of life, and we infuse solar technologies to a post-capitalist way. Yeah, so that's that. Sorry, it's a lot, but that's the invitation for us to have courageous conversations around more relational transitions. Sorry, yeah. I didn't. Online, we'll take at least 3 questions. Michelle, go ahead. And then let's go. First, and Thank you. You can move it again.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. There's a lot there. And I'm going to just respond as someone involved in the volume. So just ideas around how to narrow your chapter and focus your argument. So the whole beginning, I'm not really clear on how you incorporate the capitalist scene. You talked a lot about that, but I don't know that it warrants so much time. I mean, it could just be a quick point. And I never saw what the paradoxes were. You don't need, I think you're doing too much, and I think you should say there's a paradox and tell us what the paradox is, and then show how that happened. So I actually think that probably the focus should be your case study. It's actually really interesting, and I think that's where the paradox is. It's supposed to be this energy transition, and yet you're showing that the community, it's not only not an energy transition in which they're benefiting from, but they also, as they got returned to the land, were kind of forced to be in this binary relationship still, and in kind of assumed to only need land so that they can be in the capitalist project. I think that's what you were basically saying. They didn't actually get to determine their own relations to the land as they were returned. And then I think that probably a few of the examples where there were different relations would be a nice juxtaposition. But then I think what you need to carry through here more, and I don't think the whole conversation around ESCOM and stuff is totally relevant here. I think it kind of gets you off track. You only have 6,000 words. So the role of the state doesn't come out enough in terms, I know it's just, I mean, you talk about on one hand, you're making it sound like, the way you almost juxtaposed it, it was bad how ESCOM has evolved, but then you were also almost implying that ESCOM was good compared to what we have now. So I think you need to think through that a bit more and talk about the role of the state in this energy transition. And it would be ideal if these other cases had a different role of the state, because that's, this book is about rethinking the state and its relations to these things. So I think you need to bring that out a bit more.
Okay, that's great. Let's take all three comments, Asha, and then George.
Yeah, it's more of a comment. So in Mauritius, the IPPs were copied, and they're basically the bourgeoisie. They are only the bourgeoisie, and they use South African coal. It killed people. It still kills people. The waste is thrown into the sea. It only has recently stopped because people took pictures and videos. And remember when we were talking about those who were against inoculation, like strongly against it, these were the same people who own and who fought. And the agreements were kept secret till 2013. And to date, we haven't found anyone that can decipher for the legal terms of these. So I don't know if we can find a contribution and add something that could kind of blend in or make the link.
Yeah, I've got two comments that necessary. The first is my framing of the South African system of accumulation is one of the rules and energy conflicts that has become financialized. And part of the story, and I actually said this to some of our new people in Parliament recently, is that, the Anglo-American and the large corporations asked to be nationalized in the 20s, when they wanted a national electricity grid to support their mining businesses. They actually set up their own generation. And I think that relationship between energy and the extractivism, and now the extractivism through financialization, continues as a partnership within the minerals energy finance complex. So I'm not saying you should follow that kind of few, but that's sort of how I organize this thinking in my head. And I think that for me, it makes sense. It also makes sense where there seem to be contradictions, like government de-risking or government taking over, or government providing cheap electricity to the energy intensive user group, even though we had load shedding and want to charge everybody else too much. And I think that then also means that even within the system, moving towards a just transition means, uh, you know, addressing what that system of accumulation means. The second point I want to make is that there's a group that developed mostly in Europe. I know the people at Manchester University working on the foundational economy. And I think the notion of decommodifying goods that are foundational for people, basic needs, services, including education, health, energy, food. There's this argument that all of that should actually be decommodified. And that makes up, if you look at South Africa's government spending, it's about 20% of GDP. If you look at the insufficient and inadequate levels of public sector investment, particularly in services infrastructure, that's only about 5%. It could be 10 to 15%. So we could be looking at 35% of GDP outside and decommodified, outside of the capitalist base of the South African economy. And I think, we should, and you can expand that more. We could also say, Sasol is a huge polluter. Maybe that should be redrawn, renationalized, and reshaped to do something else as part of a kind of decommodified economy as well. So over time, we could maybe start taking back what's been financialized and commodified and part of that capitalist economy. But I really like this. I mean, I like your framing in terms of, this, how we see nature and how we commodify everything, and how through that, we end up with systems of accumulation that are destructive and an antithesis to just transition. So I think in South Africa, we need to sort of maybe mobilize in that sense. And the last point I want to make is linked to that. And one of the things we've been pointing out in Parliament is to say that so many people are supposed to be getting free basic services like electricity, but provided by local governments. But the Public Finance Management Act actually has this assumption that local governments can raise 90% of their own revenue. So in the division of revenue across the spheres of government, the whole model is messed up because none of the local, or very few local governments can actually self-finance through rates, through electricity sales and that. And now also with the thing that Treasury's done for non-payment to Eskom, saying that we'll help you pay off that debt if you stop selling electricity. So the business model of many local governments is being undermined. And so the whole system and the way in which austerity operates in South Africa means that local governments have an incentive not to provide people with free basic services like electricity, and to use that money for other expenditure like paying their staff. So I mean, I think in terms of just thinking about justice, and I actually believe that local government should be providing renewables, and it should be non-commodified. It should be providing people free electricity based on using renewable source of energy. But we've totally shifted and made this a commodified thing. Thank you. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Quick response. Just
Well, these are a lot, but yeah, so I take some of the comments, but I want to say I will sort it out in the paper, but I want to connect the paradoxes from a global perspective and how South Africa is entrenching an imperial agenda. And that goes to the ontological aspects. And yeah, so there's the reductionist science, there's the notion of the Anthropocene, because that's like the gospel in all the climate discourses. And then also bring them down to to how it's affecting people's access. Like, you know, the cost of electricity is exorbitant in this country. And then also the relationships with land, because while we planting all these infrastructures on land, that is land that has contributed significantly to climate change through monocultures and fertilizers. And the accounting doesn't include that when government is measuring its solar and renewables. So yes, I mean, I did get a lot. I mean, it's a lot there, but I want to get a thread and to link the kind of global discourse, also ontologically, historically, colonial addictions so I didn't put this here, but like the work of also Barad of how to trace the past. Actually, her work is around like tracing the ghost, and that the past is not erased but threaded in the present. And so yeah, but I leave the other stuff like Cecil and to the political economy people to figure that out. But I want to say there's a fundamentally I guess challenge around this response. And I just what's it Takish Kumar, I don't really know, he was the founder of the Schumacher Institute, said like our education is anti-life and anti-nature. So I want to make that explicit, and that is a violence that is emerging, and South Africa is doing it through investment growth, and in this case with the independent power users. But thanks.
Thank you. It's on. Can you hear me? Is it on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Ferrial, are you online? Can we get Ferrial?
I am online. Good morning, everyone.
Over to you. Over to
Okay.
you.
All right. Good morning.
We can see you.
So, can you see me? Okay, I haven't got a presentation, and but I'm going to talk through what I have. Okay. So I have to say I have two versions because that's just how my brain was working. What I'm going to be looking at is rethinking the state and looking in terms of taking that towards a water commons governance. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I'm hoping to, in this paper, to firstly explore the concept of water commons governance, and then also emphasizing the need to have a shift in how our water resources are presently being managed and distributed, but using a very South African perspective on the traditional approaches of prioritizing economic efficiency over equitable access and what is happening right now. But I look at it and I trace it from 1994 mostly. So the idea is to look at what were the decisions that were taken in 1994 that affected how water is managed. How has that manifested into what we're living through now? And so there's been some responses, but how those responses have moved us further to the right in terms of more control. So, and then looking at how then can the model of community and democratic decision making shift that and trying to fight back for a social justice commons approach to water governance. So that's in a nutshell what my paper's about. So I look at how South Africa's government approaches water management, and then how it compares to a water commons governance. And for that, I use a lot of the CJCM water policy document that we've developed. And I give examples of community and democratic decision-making that's at play on a local government. So it does take a bit of the theory, but I haven't really gone into much of the theoretical, except for It's funny enough, Michelle, you mentioned McDonald, and I'm using his paper, a different paper of his as well, of course, on the privatization. I'm using the David McDonald's The Bell Tolls for Thee, one of it, which is funny that you mentioned it as well. I think that so what I do is I start off with the fact that a comment which is very telling from the Minister Mchunu, who said that in terms of water, even those who live in shanty towns should pay, because if they can afford mobile phones and televisions, they can afford water. And I think that is a very telling idea, and that sums it up in terms of the governance of water, and that the fact that there's no idea of a water commons when South Africa is looking at it. So I touch on the background, which looks at South Africa as a water scarce country and the impacts of climate change, looking at the state of our water a little bit. But I also talk about the fact that as a direct result of a neoliberal push around 1994, for a weakened fiscal role of the state, and I use here something that Dale McKinley wrote using David McDonald's article about the privatization of water, and how there was this move to actually decentralize water and to get local governments to turn towards commercialization and privatization of basic services. That's water, electricity, sanitation, and health. So that is what I think has set up for the last 30 years what we've been going through and where we are right now. In addition, there have been some older policies that have stayed in use, which has influenced how things are happening. So, for example, there's a case in the Western Cape where an old 1956 apartheid policy is still being used to entrench farming and mining communities' understanding of how they can use. And when I say communities, I'm talking about the industries, right? Farming and mining industries and how they have access and can use water. So if we look at what happened in Cape Town during the Day Zero, farmers were hoarding water and then felt as if they were doing people a favor by releasing some of that water. And in Lemon's Hook Valley, in the Western Cape, there was conflict between big farmers and small emerging farmers, because the big farmer basically diverted water from a river, and according to policy, you not allowed, that's illegal, but he was given the right to do this, and he was using this 1956 policy that allowed him to do that, which then basically cut off people, and it's still happening amongst farming communities. So then I try to take the idea that if we look at water and the narrative that's been spun in present day media, a lot of it is about localized Johannesburg, localized Cape Town, localized Nelson Mandela Bay, when actually it's a South African challenge and it's a South African policy of water that is the problem. And so that I go into some of the statistics around the fact that government talks about access to water, access to sanitation, when they're actually not doing very well. And I think we all know those percentages, and I use government's own reports on that. And then I talk about how the policies from 94 about that decentralization, about the push to private, has led to where we are, which is the polycrisis in South Africa's water sector, and where we are right now. So I talk about the infrastructure decay, the issue of what is this thing of non-revenue water, the levels of pollution where the focus is on local government everywhere, but there's industrial, agricultural pollution that's going by unmonitored, uncharged, so there's no kind of control over that. And the fact that climate change becomes an issue that's way in the bottom, even though UNICEF has said time and time and again that the way that we are going to feel the impacts of water impacts of climate change is through water, whether it's flooding or drought. And we've seen that that is something that's very clear, but the response has been a policy response that has been very neoliberal, and it hasn't taken into account the real impacts that we're feeling. The whole idea of, then I talk about the institutional weaknesses, and part of those institutional weaknesses directly links to the policies that they've adopted. And that then leads to the inequitable access and the whole idea of free basic water, etc. And so we've got this mess because of the policies that they've set up in 1994. Here's where we are. And I'm looking at some of the practical examples that they've used. So the one thing that they've used is called Operation Vulundlela. And the whole idea of Operation Vulundlela was to fast track and to focus on water services as a whole. But what it does is it favors industry again. So it fast tracks water use licenses. There's a lack of transparency and accountability. And what it does is it takes the commons even further away from our reach. And that is what's happening, is that as they had this policy, there's a mess, and to fix the mess, they're actually making it worse. So that's the one area that they're doing, but they've also amended policy. So the National Water Act has been amended, the Water Services Act has been amended, and a lot of that is looking at changing now the process again, but saying that they will strip municipalities of responsibility by appointing a water provider, and that could be the private sector. So there's still that kind of move even further to privatize water they say they don't privatize water, they're privatizing the service, which for me is the same thing. It's just how you define privatize. And that's something also I talk about, in that there's different ways to privatize water. And that's also from some research that's been done with the African Water Commons Collective in Cape Town, where there's this kind of the different ways of looking at privatization. And one of it is privatizing the service itself. So I do quote Minister Mfuno a little bit, because he says in one of his interviews in March 2024, he says, I am very, very, very worried, and then goes on to say that we've created a National Water Resources Infrastructure Agency to oversee major projects and basically take in a lot more of the kind of privatizing of issues, water service providers, licenses, etc. And I in that section was saying that I too am very, very worried, but because of the direction that this is taking. I then go on to, so there's a lot more on that, but then I go on to, okay, so let's now talk about, there is this mess, what needs to happen on the ground? And that's when I come into defining what the Water Commons is, and I haven't expanded very much on this, but this is the idea of the chapter, is that defining the Water Commons and defining it into today's kind of system that we're in, and then I'm looking at real examples of what's being done. So I talk about the fact that we need to look at how do communities reclaim the water commons, and there are simple examples that I'm using of how the state is pushing back on that. So in simple ways, and it's not a water example per se, but it's a political one. So I'm thinking about whether I need to use that. So please help me on that. There was a local councillor in some town, I think you may have seen the newspaper. He was painting lines on the road or road signs or whatever, and he was arrested for it. And he was released, and then he came out and he started doing the same thing, fixing the roads and fixing basic services, and he was arrested for it. There was the case of the Harrismith water warriors, where government basically issued an interdict saying that they cannot touch the water pipes and all of that. So how do we work within those constraints? Because their argument is, well, they'll damage the infrastructure. And that's something I'm grappling with. because there's a part of me that's the science and that's like, yeah, we are damaging the infrastructure, but then people are doing it, they're fixing it, and it doesn't take rocket science to do this. So I'm grappling a little bit, but then I'm using the statement in the Commons. I'm looking at all the new policies that's coming out and the new decisions, and unpacking how that's going to be much of a status quo, or else taking us even further to having less access to water. So how do we shift that to a climate justice kind of water commons approach? And I'm using some of our comrade Vish's words, where we will not be able to fix our water challenges using the same thinking and actions that have resulted in the mess we are in. We need a renewed thinking and approach, which is an important path to finding water justice in an unjust system. And then I look at the CJCM alternative policies particularly, but this time I'm actually giving examples. So I'm still searching, I'm still researching in terms of what do we mean by this commons, by build from below. So I'm giving examples of community water management committees, and I'm taking a little bit of liberty in that what I've seen from your very urban middle class areas is this WhatsApp groups. And within that, knowledge is being built, and voices are louder, and they kind of being more active on water management decisions. And how does that then compare to what is going on at the non-middle class areas or the poorer kind of communities? How are they engaging? And that is literally having committees, having your church groups. How are they working with engagement and mobilization? And one of the things, and I'm sorry to be using this, but one of the things that we found has worked as both engagement, mobilization, advocacy, and pushing for cleaner water has been citizen science. So I bring in the idea of activist citizen science and how we're using science to counter arguments and to change behavior. So one of the examples, okay, so that was stolen by AfriForum, or was it AfriForum or one of these political parties in Tipalaseng, is we were working with groups that were testing using the water test, the citizen science testing stuff. And we were finding that the water's polluted. And they did it over 6 months. And that was then taken, and a case was then run, and they then did laboratory tests. But it was people on the ground testing first. And then this became a political matter. And that is something else I'm grappling with, is that as we're moving to local government elections in 2026, I'm finding a lot of noise in terms of the politicization and the kind of political party kind of posturing that's happening around the water commons, using what we've been saying about activist citizen science. But I'm finding it difficult. So then I do go into, like I said, defining the commons and talking about water activism, but then how does that manifest in the practical things? How do we take that citizen science activism? Now, if people have seen, we've worked previously on the climate justice water policy, where we talk about how do we challenge the policy framework and look at how do we take the issues and look at water pricing, because all of that's part of the commons, right? How do we look at costs of climate-related pollution? The issue of free basic water is not being done properly, and how do we make that something that is a voice that can be challenged, that challenges the allowance and the allowance amount? And then there's some other examples I use where I show the bad decision making in terms of climate related issues on our water source areas, where government has rather prioritized the Limpopo special economic zone rather than the water source areas in Limpopo. So there's all of that in the paper. It's a lot. And I think I'm sometimes finding it that I'm getting lost in the amount of stuff. So that's my kind of where I'm at. Thank you. Charles, everyone's on mute. Okay, not so. Okay.
Hi, Ferrial. Thanks for your presentation. I just want to ask a question on the point you made, which I think is a very important point regarding rethinking the role of the states within the polycrisis and how reflexive or responsive it is to being able to address these crises. When we were talking about that person who kept getting arrested for painting the street signs and whatnot, and
Sorry,
how,
Owande, I can't hear you very well. Can you speak louder, please?
oh, I'm using my inside voice. Okay. When you spoke about that guy getting arrested for repainting the street signs, and the water warriors being told not to get involved with the piping infrastructure. And those are two very specific examples, but I think it speaks to what space is afforded to communities and people in acting out their agency, being able to deal with, these crises where they face them. So I think at the big level of fixing the state, yes, obviously, how do you make the state more responsive to these problems? How do you help the state be guided into being able to approach it correctly? But the state deal with any crises if it doesn't empower its citizenry to be able to meet those crises where they're occurring. So I know you said that you're struggling with it, but what are some of the ways in which you've tried to think around it, and are you seeing any kind of shoots in your mind of possible avenues that you're not necessarily fully confident in because you haven't expressed them to us, but that you think are worth thinking about at least?
Let's take a few, let's just take all the comments and what it mean.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ferrial, for that presentation. Bomani from Durban. Yeah, it's very mind-boggling, to really think about the issues of water, and yet our constitution actually, Section 27(1)(b) actually guarantees access to sufficient water, as well as Section 2 as well, 27(2). So sub 2. So basically, it's worries because it seems like the issue of energy as well. It's a big question as to the energy that is produced by power producers. The big question is energy for who? So even the water as well, as its guarantees in our constitution. So I think it's time that we ask ourselves as to it's water for who? Because it seems like the people that are prioritized, or it's only industries that are prioritized, and yet people are, or we are guaranteed, in terms of our constitution. And interestingly as well, the issue of pollution that you spoke about, that's my last point. It's true. And we see a lot of commercial agriculture activities polluting our water resources, as well as a number of municipality infrastructure. For example, looking at the sewage works and the other likes as well. But no one is held accountable, and it's affecting our fish, our marine life, and it's also affecting subsistence fisher folks, because obviously, it's seeping out of the farm area into our water streams, into the ocean, into our river oceans, as well as, and obviously, there's a ripple effect, and there's no one that is held accountable. So a municipality, they're at fault because they're also contributing, and there's a huge lack of enforcement. And I like the water community system, because it empowers our people to understand the water that they are using, and it's a very user-friendly tool. So I applaud WaterCan for that, to just empower our people so that they do not rely on receiving information or results from our authorities. Thanks.
Just take Michelle and Jackie.
Vish, can I just answer those and then take the other ones? Okay, Michelle, go ahead.
They're just, he's gonna have two more.
Yeah, we'll have a second round. It's quite, no, we'll have a second round. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so Ferrial, again, this is around the chapter for the book. So it's great, and it's really lovely to see how your work has evolved over the years. So I think in the book, again, this is a book trying to get us to think about rethinking state theory. So spending some time on the neoliberalization of what's happened is I think important, but I think these ideas around, you know, the citizen science, and even the infrastructure, the way in which citizens are trying to actually reclaim, and these ideas around the commons are really going to be crucial. So I don't know if you listened yesterday, but Isaac talked about Kerala, and what he was talking about there is how important it is to have civil society active, and how important it is to have this activation from below to have any kind of transformative politics and to shift the state in any direction. We have that in South Africa. We have civil society. We just don't have the state willing to listen. So I think getting us to rethink this, the state in some ways, in your case, is a great example to say, actually, citizens are there. They are doing the activism. They know what we need. And then you can show what, you know, gesture to what the state would need, but also show the ways in which the state's kind of entrenchment in a particular framing prevents it from being people-centered. So I think I'm just trying to push you to focus on that in the chapter, because this is, you know, a book trying to get us to rethink, and I think you have great cases to help us rethink on the local level.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to just add Jackie quickly? And then you'll have a second round.
Mine is also a comment, not so much a question. I think one of the problems with the neoliberalization of common or public goods like water is that neoliberalism is predicated on getting the maximum return for the least amount of input and effort. And so what you see in Johannesburg particularly is the decline of water infrastructure. And in a way that rolls back all the things that the government has promised people. Sanitation and water rolled out to everybody. But if you walk, if you go 3 kilometers down the road, you will get to Brixton. And I've been watching the the whole idea of infrastructure degrading in Brixton, and the areas around these are poorer areas. And they are very, very often without water. But since the ANC has lost some of its power in the last elections, all of a sudden we have an enormous infrastructure project going on in Brixton. I mean, every morning when I come to Wits, they have like dug up new places. They are building the most enormous reservoir, but it's taken 3 years of like literally people blocking the areas, burning, tires, for this to happen. But it's caused the local government to think innovatively. They had used a government school, where they are putting the reservoir under the school's playing fields, and they are using the space that they have. But it's taken a crisis and a lot of civic activism before we've gotten here. But, it goes to show that when there is this push and government starts to see communities moving, things change.
Okay, so Ferrial, please answer, and then we'll have a second round. Sabine and I think the comrade here wants to ask.
Okay. So I think if I'm just in terms of Owande, how do you make the state more responsive was the kind of gist of the question, if I'm correct. Just let me, because I couldn't hear him properly. Is that correct?
Yeah.
More or less?
But what room is there for citizens to be agent? How does the state expand their agency to help themselves?
Yeah, so
Can you repeat that, because I couldn't hear him?
The question is more around citizens' agency and the
Yeah.
responsibility of the state and whether it enables or disables that. It's something.
Right, right. Okay, I think that that also links to something that I was, as Michelle was speaking. So yes, I think that the challenge is it's exactly what's happening, is that the state is trying to pretend to be the provider by, you know, they use this whole thing of, we know it's nonsense, the public participation processes. And we need to, and that's something also, Michelle, that I'm talking about, is how do we make these public participation processes not a tick box exercise that reinforces the state role. And so it is a challenge, one day, and I'm also grappling with that, because what we're finding is that as you go out of the urban areas and the smaller towns, people have resigned, and it's very much part of the way that government has structured itself, that it's disempowered people and people's agency. So people sit and say, but what is government doing? When is government going to do? And the protests are sometimes about government need, and that's good. But what it does also is that once water is flowing and once water is happening, then that kind of voice and agency becomes resigned again. So that's something I'm grappling with as well, and that needs to come out. It's not so easy that once they're working on citizen science that is happening. The Brixton idea, just by the way, the reservoir has been in the pipe in the pipelines for actually a long time. It was not party specific, and some of the cleaning up happened with Minister Mkhunu, as much as there's some issues, but some of the cleaning up happened there. I do think that thank you, Michelle, for guiding me on that in terms of rethinking the state and ideas, and bringing out stronger the ideas around citizen science and how citizens can reclaim, because it is a difficult one. And there are examples. I have, in KZN, where people didn't have water for 3 years. They were reliant on a river, using water testing kits, got attention, got water tanks within 3 days, got flowing water within a week, and everything was fine. And within 4 weeks, that all collapsed again. So the state's actually exhausting people's agency. So you think, I'm going to fight, but then it gets back. So we have to change the structure. We have to change how this government is working. So that's my thinking. On the issue of, no one is held accountable. And it is affecting a whole range of communities. I agree. I think that also when people are being held accountable, and that is something I do bring in, but I didn't talk about it, is you've got the Department of Water and Sanitation as the national oversight body that has laid 88 criminal charges against municipalities. By the way, they haven't laid any criminal charges against industry or commercial or agriculture, mostly on municipalities, but they do not fine people. They do not hold people accountable. They hold a whole municipality accountable. So it just feeds the system of bad behavior. So that's something also that I'm trying to look at in terms of what does accountability mean. And I think if we change those kind of things, where people have a right to decide who your MMC is of water, for example, the MMC of water, of infrastructure and development in Johannesburg, 2 months ago said he doesn't know about the water challenges in Joburg. There's no water issues. There's no water crisis in Joburg. So how do we get to a point where we grow agency and people have empowered to know that they must change that municipal manager person? So those are the kinds of things I'm grappling with. And the fact that agency, I'm finding, is sometimes very short-lived. It's periodic, and it's also campaign related. So I don't have water for 10 days in my area. I'm going to protest. I'm going to be involved in decision making. I'm going to ask the right questions. As soon as the water is flowing, I'm wasting. I'm washing my gardens, and so how do we link it as well to the bigger picture of climate and that? So I'm really, I can go down a rabbit hole, but all of those things are important.
Okay. go ahead.
Okay, this is Siraj. I just want to start with raising a question about what citizen activism means in a country with continued spatial apartheid and highest levels of inequality in the world, right? Because
Sorry, just repeat that, Suraj. Continued what?
continued spatial apartheid. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And the highest levels of inequality in the world, and so there's a really good paper by Ben Bradlow looking at Joburg, and he finds that in the formerly white suburbs, the rich suburbs, there's the ability to organize, be activist, and also align with the property developers, the real estate companies, etc. And they imposed huge amounts of pressure on Joburg, and money that Joburg had actually planned on spending on improving infrastructure for poorer areas was then diverted towards the richer areas. And so I think in thinking through this, I mean, and looking at examples that you used about, certain activism in terms of looking at water quality or fixing roads and stuff, I think some of that gets used by the more affluent and as you said, politically, becomes part of people's local government campaigns and stuff. And so I sort of wonder, how is it possible to have a more from poor areas, a much more of a groundswell. And linked to that, I think we see huge problems in local government linked to austerity. And so on the one hand, I'd like to see sort of more campaigns. We're raising this as an anti-austerity measure, sort of looking at, and people coming to present in Parliament saying, we need to change the fiscal policy framework, not just talk about the problems within local government, but also possibly, would local governments be a space to organize and then find allies within the struggle? Because I think people within local government are struggling. There may be lots of corrupt people or inefficient people, but I think the issues are systemic, and it's linked to long-term austerity and under spending and the crazy revenue raising model that they impose on local governments, right? They can't actually run and provide services. I think Tracy Leisure has done amazing work, for instance, on this at Clary. So I worry about the way that we're seeing the struggles happening and the way in which government is being sort of just, especially local government people are just being seen as part of the problem. When maybe with some activism, they could be seen as part of the community and both as part of grassroots organizations to say, we don't want this privatization, we want to build the commons, etc. The last point I just want to make is there's a literature on systems of provision that Ben Fine and Kate Bayliss and Kibat Sowas particularly have been part of developing, which I think is a really interesting way, a multidisciplinary way of looking at service provision and how it's done and the cultural, the consumer, all kinds of the financialization of it and commodification of it within that. And it may be a useful framework, not necessarily for this chapter, but generally for thinking about services provision. Thank you.
Great. And then somebody here, somebody here.
Okay, greetings, Maria.
No, you can speak.
Okay, greetings, Maria. This is Christina from Ghana. What I wanted to outline is on this activism space, what we require the most is professionality, because we just activists that are making noise, trying to test water, and we don't have the ability to do that, to profile our findings and whatever that we got. So my issue is that for us enabling community activists to training so that they're able to test the water for themselves, it is very much important, even though the government or politicians end up taking that and leading. I think somehow because of we don't have enough resources, we should see the facts that we should which part of program that we have to do so that they can see and become aware and take over from us, because we don't have enough resources. But for us to be their eyes, maybe somehow it would help. But also we need to be in a sense that we shape them on what remedies do we require them to take. Because when we test the water and they take over that, I think it was in the great sense that they are capacitated and they are able to make noise regarding that in their capacity. And because the time we started testing water in Madiklopa, at least for the past 14 years, we were drinking contaminated water. But immediately we started testing water, at least they have given us better water than before. So my take in this is that we need skills that we are able to make proper report, and we are able to do a proper findings that people can be held accountable. Thank you.
Then we're gonna wrap up.
Thank you, Carol, for the presentation. Yeah, my biggest concern is about, when you speak about monitoring the water commons by the municipality. Currently, what we are facing is water shortages, it's a lack of and then what I can say is, how can you put fat cats to be doing the job inside the government? Because we experience that most of the government officials don't stay in the area where we are facing water shortages, because most of them buy water at the shops. Most of them have the infrastructure at their homes, so they don't care a damn what happened in the other parts of the country where people are struggling. We also face a lot of old and water sources, lack of old infrastructure. Even last year, the standing committee of government came to visit the municipality, talking about what, and the question they are asking is, what does the municipality have in place? Because they say there's no funds for all the infrastructure that is more than 100 years old, and because of the electricity problems that we are facing, a lot of pipes to break, and also there were a lot of theft happening where electricity cables were stolen from the dams that must pump the water to the reservoirs. So municipalities just say, no, we can't do nothing, because we have a procurement management that take to buy one pipe, you must wait for 3 months to install all this problems on pipelines to bring the water. So my biggest concern is, what are we gonna do to put pressure on government because of the lack of service delivery to the community. So, and also that water infrastructure is put under private companies. So they will look into, is the water needed for household, or are we going to give water to private companies like the, you know, that Western Cape is known for their wine. And also mining, they're giving a lot of water to the companies or giving it to households. So, and also and that is also a violation happening where they say people can't pay for water. And because people can't pay, they just say, no, stop, we can't give you any more water because your water bill is too high. And maybe it's less than 20,000, they just cut off everything to the households. Thank you.
So, Ferrial, if you can respond, and then we're gonna wrap up. We're actually gonna move.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vish. Thanks, Vish. Okay, thank you, comrades. That was really useful. Siraj, it would be great to have any chapters on what you talked about, systems of provision, just to understand the multidisciplinary way on service provision. That would be great. But on the point of, yeah, I mean, look, we are very spatially apartheid divided country. But the way we've been working with our citizen activism is from the ground up. So areas in, the formerly white or still white areas still use our testing kits, but as well as in other areas. I mean, we work and the nice thing about the citizen activism is that it's not just urban based. We've used it across South Africa, both in terms of urban, rural, and so that has been able to, and what we find is that there's similar trends in terms of when things are wrong, when people find that their water is a problem. And we've been able to define the next steps to take, or steps of citizen activism, which is the same actually in both those areas. And you're right about the problem is the privilege, and that still exists in terms of wealthier people have a bigger say and bigger privilege. And it's a challenge. It is still a challenge. And that is why work like we're doing in terms of building on the ground activism has to shift that and create that uncomfortable arena. So for example, we're having a site visit with Joburg Water in a couple of weeks. But instead of having the normal, very loud voices of the suburbs, we're making sure that there's a spread of people that will be in that session. And if we have to do a call before, just to make sure that people understand that they can't dominate the discussions. So those things take time and it's still a challenge, and it is part of mobilizing and activism. So we have to do that. And we do engage with local governments, but the challenge also, the reality on the ground, and if you look at the Auditor General's report, is most of the municipalities are really not doing very well. And so when you try to engage with them, they go into defense mode and they shut down. So that takes a lot of kind of advocacy, holding hands, walking the path, to make sure that you can build those relationships. And that takes time. A lot of people are doing it. The Vaal Environmental Justice Alliance in the Vaal did that very well with their municipalities. They've even been part of the catchment management forums. So it does take it's like activism and organizing. It's never just one thing, and it's a process. How do I put that into this chapter? I don't know. Maybe I should look at something. And Christina, in terms of, thank you for that. I think that's a nice example. Maybe we need to add it in terms of what you guys have done and how you've used your testing to actually get government to listen to your processes. And to the next comment, I didn't know who was speaking, but in terms of, yes, access to water. So in my chapter, I set it out in terms of water quantity and water quality, and that, yes, you can test water when you have water in your taps, but when you don't have, and there's only 46% of South Africans have water coming from their taps. There are a lot of people that don't have direct access. So that is a different activism. It doesn't mean that we're not tackling that. For example, that KZN community, which had to rely on a polluted river because their taps were dry, that is about not having water. But linked to that, and maybe I must add that in, is the example from the Cape, which is about what in the Cape they call the weapons of mass destruction, where the water monitoring devices were actually punishing poorer communities for using more water. And maybe that must be something to highlight government's focus on attacking the poor rather than dealing with the wastage that's coming from agriculture or Coca-Cola or whatever. And then on the one more thing, sorry, Comrade Vish, the previous speaker mentioned the Constitution and the act and that it sets out access. I didn't go into too much of the policy. I just go into the amendments that we have right now, because I feel as if in the last 3 articles I wrote, I covered the policy pretty well. So guidance on that would be good. And I'm thinking from what Michelle has said, that maybe less on policy is better. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay, great, thank you. This is the final contribution to the volume. Thank you, Ebo. So my starting point, comrades, the premise for this contribution to the volume, can you hear me? Is that okay? Is that
All good.
okay? Is that I'm testing a proposition also from the Climate Justice Charter movement. I'm testing its theory of transformation in how I'm thinking about this chapter, exploring a possibility that could come out of climate justice activism. So the theory of transformation of the Climate Justice Charter movement can be summarized as follows. We have a plurivision in the charter, which is about tackling the legacies of racial oppression and confronting the current polycrisis and reaching for a just, livable, and transformed future. But the second premise of this is that climate justice activism is about a political project, because what we have to do in terms of transformative decarbonization, adaptation, and regeneration is build new socio-ecological systems as part of the deep, just transition. The third aspect of our theory of transformation is that we need 4 strategies to advance this climate justice project and, if you like, restructuring of our society. We have to advance an approach globally for a climate justice bloc of peoples, workers, and movements. Secondly, we have to think in terms of a people and worker-driven climate emergency state and climate justice deal. Thirdly, we have to advance deep democracy as part of just transition pathways. And fourthly, we've got to build a movement that works with the conception of power as building transformative capacity from below. So our theory of transformation then is what I'm kind of testing in this chapter. Oh, maybe I should just add one other thing. So while we have the agential side of this theory of transformation, we also have, if you like, the structural side of this theory of transformation, which is worsening climate change. So in other words, we are beginning to experience catastrophic climate change since 1 degree Celsius increase. And catastrophic climate change is going to amplify. It's going to become more inflated. It's going to become more present in our lives. So while we as activists are trying to advance solutions to get in front of the crisis is also going to get bigger and bigger, and it's going to have a feedback into our society. And that climate determinism is also going to impact our theory of change and how we position ourselves as activists. So the big idea is the democratic climate emergency state. So I start off with state formation after apartheid and think through the conjunctures that we've had to try and remake the post-apartheid state. And in this chapter, I look at sort of 3 conjunctural moments. What happens between 1990 and 96? Bargaining with the apartheid state and labor to set up the National Economic Forum in the late 80s, with labor coming out of the 80s with a conception of the state, the democratic corporatist state. And here it had three elements to try to remake the state and relationally ensure that labor, capital, and government were shaping what the state was all about, and to some extent, community. And there were three elements to this. One was institutionalizing NEDLAC with the 1995 Act, the National Economic Development and Labor Council, which would bring these big three plus community together. The Industrial Strategy Project was another element of labor to kind of shape the accumulation model of the state. And it essentially, in some senses, embraced deep globalization. And of course, the Reconstruction Accord, including the RDP, which was about people-driven reconstruction and development in the main. So this was labor's project to remake the state in the post-apartheid period. But that project was completely defeated and displaced. The second conjunctural moment of state formation was the making of an Afro-neoliberal competition state from 1996 to 2009. And here the ANC basically manages the neoliberal shift. It deeply globalizes our economy. It takes on internationalized dimensions where the state is caught up in transnational policy circuits and the power structure, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, basically impacting what the state does and its functions. The primacy of monetary policy, again, comes to the fore, both in terms of macroeconomic policy, but also in terms of how the supply side is understood in South Africa. There's dismantling of self-sufficiency that we inherited from the apartheid state. So a key moment of remaking the state. Agriculture is a good example, removing agricultural boards, the role of the land bank, and a whole host of other policy supports. So we basically dismantle our capacity to have, if you like, a sovereign state project. And then, of course, we unleash BEE accumulation to establish and promote the interests of a new black capitalist class and emergent black middle class. So that's the conjuncture from 1996 to 2009, where an Afro-neoliberal competition state comes to the fore in South Africa. We then have a shift in the conjuncture to a criminalized competition state. And this basically is the state party black capitalist accumulation nexus. State capture at all levels, from local government, we heard from Ferrial about audits for local government to the top. And of course, the Zondo Commission gives us evidence to this effect. So the state in South Africa, post-apartheid, really gets transformed in very historically specific ways. We move away from a non-racial constitutionalism to an Africanized state and a market democracy. The Finance Ministry and the Reserve Bank, together with transnational policy-making circuits, become the center of the state. And we have a contracting enclave economy and a polycrisis of socio-ecological reproduction. So this is the short story, or the abbreviated story, of state formation post-apartheid and kind of what's come to the fore. I then look at the polycrisis of the criminalized competition state in South Africa. And so, I look at key, if you like, aspects of this polycrisis. So, the obvious one is corruption and the collapse of state parastatals and failing state delivery at various levels. So we have a state that has completely been eviscerated of capacities to deliver. And that's got to do with the kind of looting kind of logics that have overcome the state. We have climate shocks that are part of our polycrisis now. More and more climate is featuring in our everyday lives. It's registering as the big drought we had and day zeros, the Durban rain bomb, floods, coastal storm surges, the tornado in Tongaat. And basically, we have a state almost in an incomprehension state. It has policy around climate. It even has a climate change act right now. But again, these climate shocks are not featuring at the center of the state response. Okay. Right now, we're also beginning to see climate refugees. Many people from the Durban rain bomb are still living in makeshift shelters. In Tongaat, people have left Tongaat because their homes have been destroyed and the state support has not been forthcoming. We have climate migrants, refugees in our country. So we have the COVID-19 moment, and to be brief here, I mean, basically, and we said this yesterday, the state went into COVID with a failing healthcare system. 50 million people depending on a failing healthcare system faced COVID-19. And that, I believe, contributed to the high direct and excess death rates. I mean, basically, the state killed off 400,000 people. There was a mass killing. If we had a different kind of state in South Africa, with a more effective public healthcare system, say like Kerala, I believe these numbers would have been very, very different. In places like Eastern Cape, people stopped going to the hospitals because the hospitals were collapsing. It was overrun, etc. So people died at home quietly, okay? So we don't even know those numbers, actually. So there was a mass killing during COVID-19. And of course, we also had the July 2021 riots, which were basically a product of desperation, a state failing to feed its population. So state failure came through thick and fast around COVID-19. There's a polycrisis related to macroeconomics and the regime of socio-ecological reproduction in this country. Our macroeconomics is just not addressing the polycrisis at a systemic level. I mean, 42% structural unemployment makes this an unviable society, okay? The cost of living crisis that people are living, food prices, electricity costs, inequality. And it seems, and Siraj, you can help us here. It seems like we are back to stabilization and austerity after COVID, okay? So in a sense, this GNU is basically about a return to deep globalization. It's all about credit rating agencies again, and I would argue versus the risk to socio-ecological reproduction. So our macroeconomics is not taking on board the risks to human and non-human life. It's not, okay? And so we have a very, very desperate society. So we have an epistemological crisis in the state. It is incapable of thinking through this crisis of socio-ecological reproduction. Its economics tells us that. The policy choices they are making on austerity are telling us that, okay? So we also have the destruction of biodiversity, and this ranges across a whole set of dynamics: acid mine drainage and the pollution of our riverine systems, the kind of effluent that goes into our oceans and the destruction of our marine ecosystem, soil degradation, ecosystem stress, widespread animal deaths and species extinctions in our society, and so on. But again, the state understands the oceans and biodiversity increasingly as a commodity. It's put out a biodiversity strategy, etc. And it's treating nature as an object of exploitation. So the state is ecocidal in the context of the polycrisis, okay? Meaning it's all about the mass destruction of human and non-human life, okay? So the other indicator of the polycrisis is the state of our democracy. So our market democracy failed us for the first few decades, 2 decades. And we are now, after the last election, in a transition of this market democracy, the second transition in our democracy, beyond one-party dominance. But again, there's a lack of maturity in our political parties. They don't have answers. The level of thinking amongst these political parties is cognitively disconnected from all these dynamics of polycrisis. So you have coalition politics that is very, very fair-weathered, and it's basically reproducing polarization, okay? So we're seeing an ethnicizing of politics. We're seeing the breakdown of the National Liberation Project. And so, you know, it's about the Patriotic Alliance and colored identities. It's the MK party and Zulu identities, and so on. This is a regression in our democracy, and it's a very dangerous regression in our democracy. So in brief, this is the polycrisis. But I want to kind of build on one kind of key element of this polycrisis for my argument, and that is the climate crisis, its complexity, and the risk and the opportunity it brings. I started off this with saying that climate determinism is a big part of our theory of transformation. And I want to argue that climate systemic shocks are all about inter-systems cascades. This is the complexity. So there are complex interconnections when climate shocks register. They feed into inequality, they feed into food, they feed into the water system, they feed into biodiversity, and into the crisis of governance. So climate basically ramifies, it registers, it impacts across a whole set of socio-ecological systems. And in the context we are in South Africa, the more climate shocks we have, the worsening climate injustice and climate apartheid in our society, okay? But the climate risk that looms large is the 1.5 degrees Celsius overshoot, which would mean that we will face a 3 degrees Celsius scenario for Southern Africa. Now, this climate risk is around the corner. It's probably or likely between 2028 and 2034, according to some scientific predictions. So it's a real existential risk. It's very likely that our food system will collapse. It's very likely that most of our water sources are going to dry up. Okay, this is round the corner. So comrades in this room, if we don't get ahead of this problem with our climate justice activism, well, climate is going to make the problem a real problem. Okay, so we already going through climate shocks and risks, and we are beginning to see debt balloon. Okay, there's a whole lot of figures coming out around the Durban rain bomb, kind of infrastructure destruction because of flooding, etc. So the costs of climate are going up and going up. And again, the risk we're facing from immediate climate shocks are macro insolvency. So we already have public debt, but this is going to compound that. So the argument is that climate crisis is an entry point to address the polycrisis. So whenever we try to meet human and nature needs today, we have to link it to climate. When we're talking about climate, we have to link it to human and nature needs as well. This is where we are, whether we like it or not. Climate change and its complexity has to be at the center of everything, okay? But it provides us with an opportunity of deep, just transitions, as I've been saying, guided by our plurivision, and of course, building these deep, just transition pathways in communities, workplaces, sectors, and the state. And I'll say more about this now. So, is the answer to this climate risk the green state? And I'm arguing in this paper, no. The green state is not the answer to this polycrisis, but specifically the climate risk we are facing. The green state is actually a green neoliberal state, and we've seen this shift happening in parts of the global north. We've seen how even green parties, as part of electoral cycles, have locked into this shift, okay? So they're really about market-centered approaches that have a green gloss to it. But we're also seeing the green state central to ecological modernization. And this includes geoengineering, carbon markets, and fortress conservation. In other words, it does not seek to disrupt the capitalist accumulation. The green state is about trying to find a way in which the exploitation of nature can continue, maybe with a bit more moderation here and there, but it still continues. And it buttresses, if you like, green growth. It's still about the domination of nature. That's what I'm saying. The green state is still about the coloniality of conquest of nature. Now, people like Mark Swilling and others argue the green developmental state is the answer. And his argument is you decouple resources from growth and you recognize the complexity of socio-ecological systems. Voila, you have a green state in South Africa, and it's a developmental state. Now, I think this is a fallacious position because it's anchored in an argument supporting the National Development Plan, which talks green but promotes extractivism, big time, okay? Second, there are no ecological parties in South Africa that is capable of taking forward even this version of the green developmental state, okay? So you don't have the leadership, the political agency to even construct this. The state is in polycrisis. So yeah, if you're going to talk about a green developmental state and be declaratory about it, we got to start off from reality. And the reality is when the South African state declared it's a developmental state in 2012, well, we know what came in its wake, a criminalized competition state. And fourthly, South Africa's nation-building nationalism is polarizing and descending into racism, ethno-nationalism, and xenophobia. One of the preconditions for a developmental state, at least the lesson from Asia, is that you need an ambitious nationalism, a purposive nationalism. We don't have that in this country. So this version of the green developmental state is going nowhere. I want to argue that what we need to focus on is the imperative of a democratic climate emergency state. And I'm talking about a state form that can be constructed in a manner that takes us beyond electoral cycles, and it takes us beyond elite transactional governance. Now, what am I talking about? Okay. I'm talking about a state that is built on a consensus that recognizes that it has to be a post-normal state. There's no business as usual here. We have to confront an existential risk. Climate will wipe us all out, comrades, if we do not foreground it. It is also a complex systemic crisis, as we've been talking about, interconnections between different dimensions of this crisis at a systemic level. But we are also dealing with long-range problems. So let me give you an example. For climate to be addressed seriously, like thoughtfully and seriously, we're looking at about 3 centuries of dealing with this problem. Our politicians just deal with vacuous, shallow electoral cycles. We are talking here about 12 generations. Okay, this is a long-range problem. Okay, so how can we deal with it through normal state practices? We can't. We've got to deal with this as a post-normal state challenge. We also got to build democratic consensus, so you lock this in, where there's ownership of the systemic crisis and systemic alternatives by society. We need societal mobilization, and we need the ingenuity rate of collective problem solving. You see, the more brains we have working the problem, the better for society. So the water problem, citizen science, etc. The more people are seized with this challenge, the better for all of us, okay? So we need an embedded state through deep democracy. We also need a relational state system. So here, if you look at the different institutional dimensions of the state, the executive, parliament, administration, judicial apparatus, the coercive apparatus, the knowledge-producing institutions like universities, and subnational institutions like local governments, etc., we need to mainstream this consensus and this post-normal state condition into all these institutions. This has to become the center of everything. It's got to become the lifeblood of the state. It's got to become the dominant impulse in the state. So for this to happen, and to construct such a relational state system and a democratic climate emergency state, we need a climate justice bloc of class and popular forces to advance a political project while driving and embedding the state from below. So if this political precondition is not in place, we cannot construct the state. And I'm saying that the Climate Justice Charter movement on the South African political field has the most potential to take the 285 organizations that endorse the charter to move society in this direction. So this is a possibility if praxis rises to the moment, if we build our movement and take it further. So if we go in this direction, a democratic climate emergency state can embrace the following strategies for accelerated, deep, just transitions to happen. The first strategy is around relationality and the commons public partnership. The second strategy is a climate emergency social contract driven from below. The third strategy is a climate justice deal for Africa. And the fourth strategy is transitioning the interstate system to planetary commons governance. I'm going to go through each one very quickly, but I'm just going to say this, that even if our activism fails, but climate determinism kicks in and comes to the fore, these ideas are going to become a material force whether we like it or not, because they're not going to be able to handle it. and they're going to have to start thinking differently about where the state should go. So, the relationality of the state and commons public partnerships, the central, or the core idea here is ending the war with nature, okay? And this is about that partnership with nature, okay, to make it at the center of the state, place it at the center of the state. As I've been arguing, we have a state that is stuck in the old binary, society versus nature. Society dominates nature. Capitalism conquers nature. We need to displace that fundamentally. And I'm arguing here that the crucial mechanism for this partnership is the idea of the commons. It's a new paradigm that brings to the fore the ecological foundations of everything, okay? It places the state on new ground if we foreground the commons. So the commons is the commonwealth, land, water, biodiversity, creative labor, the earth system, our cultural heritage, public infrastructure. It is life-enabling systems, ethically used and democratically governed through socio-ecological relations to ensure the common good and flourishing of the web of life. So what that translates into at a very practical strategic level is the notion of commons public partnerships. So the food sovereignty activism we've been engaged in is a model for this. Our act and our policy calls for a commons public partnership to transition the food system. What Ferrial was talking about, and it's something I'll encourage her to do more explicitly, is talk about the water commons public partnership even in her chapter, okay? So the commons public partnership can embrace a whole set of policies, public transport, rights of nature, community and socially owned renewable energy systems, and so on. So this is a crucial strategy, if you like, to transform the state fundamentally so it ends that war with nature, and it is democratically done, but it is also a decolonization of the state, fundamentally, okay? Because the coloniality of the state is about the conquest of nature. And this is a proposal to upend that, okay? The other important strategy is the climate emergency social contract driven from below. And very quickly, this again comes out of the climate justice charter movement, where the first element is a climate justice deal. And this is about rethinking the macroeconomy. It's about drawing on ecological economics and care and solidarity to kind of rethink macroeconomics. Why does growth have to be the center of everything? Why can't we have an index for the commons? Why can't we have a happiness index? Why can't we have a care index and so on, okay? The whole issue of placing the economy within the limits of nature, within planetary boundaries like Kate Raworth has done, is central to this shift in the framework, okay? Linked to this is a climate emergency policy platform to advance deep just transition pathways in communities, workplaces, sectors, and the state. Now, the Climate Justice Charter movement has done incredible work on this, led mainly by some of the young people in this room. And so that platform is about rolling campaigns to move communities, to move workplaces, to decarbonize, to adapt, and to be transformative in their capacities. But both these elements add up. The CJ deal and the climate emergency policy platform add up to a climate emergency social contract for the country. We don't have a social contract in this country anymore. It's all about what capital wants. It's all about capital's power over us, okay? And we've got to find a way of breaking with that logic. And so a climate emergency social contract is one way to break with that logic, and it's anchored in the idea of democratic systemic reforms from below. So we start building that next society in our communities as we move towards the water commons, for example, or food sovereignty, or socially owned renewable energy, and so on, or eco-mobility and clean energy public transport systems. Simple thing like bicycle lanes and bicycles is already shifting the local state in the direction of these kinds of democratic systemic reforms. So we build this consensus bottom up, communities, workplaces, sectors, and the state. The third strategy, very quickly, is a climate justice deal for Africa. And here I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but again, the Climate Justice Charter calls for a CJ deal for Africa, but it means various things. I'll just highlight one thing, which is the natural resources on our continent. They need to be collectivized. We cannot, as a divided Africa, deal with the global transition. We need to aggregate our power. We need to renew Pan-Africanism, whether it's the cobalt, whether it's the copper, whether it's the rare earths on our continent and so on. We need to place that in our climate justice deal with the rest of the world. Okay. So what I'm arguing for here, comrades, is that the South African state has to fundamentally overhaul its foreign policy to become a climate justice state in the interstate system, but first and foremost, rallying Africa. Okay, this should become the linchpin strategy for changing geopolitics and opening up space and opportunities for us to move as a continent towards a deep, just transition. And the last strategy, comrades, is transitioning the interstate system to planetary commons governance and earth democracy. Now, you know, I've heard the president talk on the platform of the G20 recently, I think it was in Brazil, saying that South Africa in the G20 presidency will contribute to reform of the global multilateral system. I can tell you now, that reform is not going to go far enough, okay, for the kind of world we are in. We need an imaginary that really confronts the global polycrisis. Multilateralism is in a deep crisis, comrades. It's not producing the solutions. The UN COP sitting in Azerbaijan is not going to solve the climate crisis, okay? So we have to go beyond reform towards transformation of the multilateral system, okay? We have to start thinking about these complex problems as cross-border problems or transnational problems and as planetary challenges. So we can go as far as we can as South Africa in terms of our just transition and so on, but we're going to have to shift geopolitics at a global scale. At the heart of this is the stateless question. There are going to be millions and millions of people that are going to be stateless. 200 million African people are going to be displaced by climate shocks over the next decade, okay? What you going to do with them? Is the old interstate system, nation state container going to absorb them? No. Island states are going to disappear very fast, okay? What's going to happen to those people, okay? So we are in a global transition whether we like it or not. And I'm arguing that as part of our foreign policy is that we need to be working towards a new planetary institutional architecture for the planetary commons governance, so our oceans, our climate system, etc., and earth democracy. So we need to go beyond the interstate system. We need to start imagining a world in which we are now planetary citizens, if you like, earthlings. And of course, to conclude, there are various challenges with this perspective. To come back to the realism of things, the first challenge is, of course, the constant normalizing of the climate and crisis by our power structure and our elites, our Presidential Climate Commission. So they don't think in these terms, okay? They think in terms of the reductionist science that Zora was talking about. They think in terms of the pragmatic incremental shifts, the low-hanging fruit, so they don't disrupt accumulation. And they are wrong because they're going to take us again into a mass killing and a mass die-off of people and non-human life. We are also, our ruling class is locked into accumulation at all costs with a tinge of green, okay? So this ruling class that we have is incapable of confronting this polycrisis, okay? And thirdly, there's more carbon nationalism and fossil fuel extraction that is at the forefront of the state's agenda. And many of you in this room are fighting the fight against that. And then, of course, the convergence around a climate justice political project and a block from below. This comes back to the challenge facing your activism. Can you unite? Can you build across society the the political bloc that can redirect South Africa? Can we have a renewed mass politics post-national liberation? And finally, building societal consensus from below through deep just transition work, pathway work in communities, workplaces, sectors, and the state. So we start constructing that climate emergency social contract. It will not fly if it is not anchored and rooted amongst the people. Okay. Thank you for your time. Okay, I'm open to your guidance, questions, comments. Let's move up the row here. Go ahead, Siraj.
Thanks. I see we're ahead of time, so I can speak a lot. Well, I've got a lot to say. Maybe I'll come back in a second. Sorry, Michelle, no.
No, you go for it.
Protect me from my chair.
Go.
So, I mean, I'm in total agreement with your framework. I just want to bring in or bring out some issues where I would add emphasis. And to start with, I would say, and this has been something that's really bothered me since. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Okay. It's bothered me since the whole notion of the Guptas and state capture and the what part of what you calling what is the criminalized state has become at the center of our discourse, and it's actually then undermined the ability to see the state as transformational, right? But also it's distracted people from the role of the private sector, of capital. And what I've been trying to do with a lot of my research and writing is to bring capital back in, the nature of, especially South African capitalism. And so in terms of thinking about state formation, for instance, my friend Firoz Khan and I wrote the paper that was published last year, or maybe the year before, I forget, looking at the transition. And we argue that there's a continuity in that state formation and policy formation, and it relates to the crisis of the apartheid government in the 70s and how P.W. Botha basically handed over economic policy formation to the elites of the corporates that still continue to dominate every sector of the economy. And basically then Derek Keys and others became Mandela's ministers in the government of national unity. Every economics ministry, including things like agriculture and land affairs and environmental issues, was either somebody from big business, like Derek Keys, or the banking sector, or from the apartheid government, like Pik Botha as Minister of Minerals and Energy. And in that process, even within the shift from the RDP to the RDP white paper, the Trevor Manuel and others imposed a neoliberal concept of the state's role and what macro policy would be. And you didn't mention Merg, you mentioned the ISP. I mean, the shutting down of Merg fairly violently. I was a research trainee in the Merg, so I still have scars. The macroeconomic research group, sorry for the younger people in the room, people under 50. So there's, I think it's really important to understand that, but also within that process, in that paper on the elite transition, the roles of the elites in the transition, we basically talk about the meetings between Mandela and Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer actually says publicly, when we first met, he would say very silly things, and now he says less of them. He talks about Mandela in those kind of patriarchal terms. This is like the chief capitalist in the country. And so I think in order to understand capital, how they've become financialized, but also then how the state, the post-apartheid state has embedded themselves into a system of accumulation where they reduce the role of the state, but play a role in supporting the environmental destruction, the continued apartheid of that South Africa had, through spatial apartheid, through not addressing things, through actually adopting austerity very early. I mean, from 90, it was actually, Derek Keyes bragged that his normative economic model that he and his old apartheid finance department drew up in the before the handover to the transitional government became the MIRG. It became the government's policy from 94, not only 96. And this is where I totally agree with you. We weren't then able to transform the state, to rebuild the state to actually meet everybody's needs. And I see that as fundamentally linked to the ANC and the elites within the ANC's Department of Economic Policy aligning themselves and then becoming part of this revolving door with finance and big business and bidding. And so I think it's really important that we then still look at the minerals and energy complex, how it's become financialized, who the players are, and how they continue to dominate every sector of the economy, and see South Africa as a place for continued racial oppression, exploitation, and environmental destruction, to the point where I'm starting to think that those capitalists who dominate every sector of the economy, who sort of collude to push up bread prices and things, are willing to see how far they can squeeze us and destroy us while taking their money out until we collapse. And even in war economies, even in when there's civil strife, there's a capitalist class that can keep squeezing and make money. And I'm starting to feel I'm so depressed about South Africa. That's how I see the society. So I think capital should be at the center and understanding that transition in that sense. And then that then brings us to that. Also, I think it's really important, and I've been talking about this in Parliament, and I've gotten DA people basically threatening me and calling points of order to shut me up, where I've been saying that, you talk about state capture, but these problems existed before state capture. The destruction of Eskom and the possibility of Eskom actually shifting and changing and restructuring, the way the water provision, all these things are because of austerity and the adoption of fiscal consolidation from 2011-12. It was actually blessed by the state, the ones that were captured by the state, and it was supported by business and very much by the DA and others, and was very much part of that criminal state. And I actually believe that what we're seeing, Ferrial spoke about how the AG speaks about local government. I believe that erosion that we're seeing in local government and state enterprises is a symptom of that long-term austerity and underspending. Sorry, I'm going off of that. So the last point I wanted to make was that you spoke about we're back to austerity after COVID. But I think it's really important to realize, and people like Duma Kabule and others have done work on showing how austerity was actually central to the responses of government during COVID. Of the supposed 500 billion they were spending, 200 billion was on a guarantee to the banks to provide small businesses, support the small business guarantee loans. And they only actually spent about 14 billion of that 200 billion. The banks in South Africa aren't set up, and they're also not interested in helping small businesses, right? Especially the township-based businesses. The other was that money was moved around government, and the actual increase in government expenditure during that period is calculated to be between 37 billion and 45 billion rand. So out of this 500 billion rand program that they claim, they actually, so austerity has been there since pre-2012, but fiscal consolidation became the actual policy of government. And they're sticking to it, and now they're pushing for increasing the surplus. Sorry, I know I went on for a long time.
Thank you for that. Yeah, let's pass it on.
Gosh, Bishop, if I thought my chapter was vast, looking at yours, it's like two theses. So my comment first is on that first on the state formations after apartheid, and you go from like NEDLAC and sort of down the line. So I mean, as someone having been, inside, outside, in every institution, in the government, international, I want, I think what's needed is a deeper fault lines of these institutions themselves. And so, but also if you're writing on climate change, it would be useful to relate it to South Africa's trajectory and responses or lack of responses or around climate, because, these, there's a book by, I don't know, it's a scholar from UNISA, and he writes about the ANC has always been anti-Black. And because they were in Europe mostly for their exile. So these institutions in themselves were faulty from the beginning. And although it had a multi-stakeholder look, it was never there to give direction. And, I saw many of the community groups go to the WTO and UN. None of them even know what they're there for. So we don't, but there was a moment where government was interested in listening post 94. But they never really took any of our advices. So I think that needs to be troubled, because I don't know, sometimes we think there was a moment of like glory, post 94. Yeah, but they default lines from the beginning. That's the one point. Then I hear you about having a climate emergency state, and I'm working with colleagues from Colombia, and when I hear their process of this new government that was organized from the ground, from neighborhoods, it's a progressive government. They, Vice President, Black woman, she was a activist around mining. And I'm wondering their processes to get there. Because if we're not developing those processes, the climate charter, and while there is a 200 and odd people that sign on, we have no, I don't know, catalyst to move into some sort of organization. So, and so also when I hear so I also want to know, what is the alliances amongst academics? Because when I hear my colleagues, they are post-development, every student knows about ecofeminism. There's a whole different way of thinking. They're not into development catch-up, let me just say, where that, we teach, many of the departments teach their students. So, yes, so while, I guess this would be a great project or idea, but I would like to see more in, like some processes of building that in the chapter.
Thank you. Okay, who's next? Okay, let's keep it short.
Okay, thanks, comrade. I grabbed the opportunity. Comrade Vish, thanks for that presentation. One just wonders as to how do you unpack such information, to an ordinary person or ordinary people in our community, because this is very important information. And I fully with you, comrade, on the issue of some parliamentarians and some party fighting with you when you actually brought the issue of corporate influence in the current situation that we are in. Comrade Vish, you spoke about report on Zondo Commission. Yes, Zondo Commission, it was one commission that everyone was waiting for, but also I think it's also very narrowed as well, because there was a narrow propaganda and agenda or focus on that. I think all of us are quite aware of. So I think it's very important that we also question and say, okay, yes, Zono Commission was there's a report, but also I think we need to also look at as to how inclusive was it in terms of looking other experts that, for example, looking at the issue of Marikana killings, the mass killings in Marikana, to me, and probably other people in other communities, that was also part of corruption, but it wasn't included. Why? Because it was minors that were protesting for their rights, but they were killed because of corporate influence. Corporate influence is in line, or it's in sync with corruption, but it's nowhere in this report. So it's something that we should actually really zoom in and say, was it really inclusive? Why was it inclusive? Because of, obviously, we know the people that were behind the Marikana killings. So I think we need another reload commission. I know taxpayers' money, billions were spent, but I don't think we need taxpayers' money to be spent, to be spent again, but we need a reload of the Zondo Commission that will look at issues of Marikana mass killings, and also looking at Phala Phala, for example, So let us now, as in we are in 2024, approaching 2025, let us say, hey, yes, Zondo Commission was done, but we still have other major issues that happen from 2022 to now that still need to be inclusive. We should not look at the Zondo Commission as the big brother or an accurate report and as the Bible. So there's a lot to ask, but in respect of time, I'll just pass on the mic. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Fish, for that. It was there's so much thought and prompting of thought processes, and in referring to the state, just with Michelle's presentation, Ferrial's presentation, you've alluded to it as well. I think with Michelle, that iceberg slide and looking to what is below the surface, and then Vish, something that really, you talk about 12 generations. Here we sit 30 years into democracy, still grappling with these issues. And when referring to the state, I also feel that the one state entity is the Department of Education that absolutely needs to be pushed, because, I've taught in an array of schools, from community schools to one of the most affluent schools in Cape Town. And we find that the term holistic education, especially in the more affluent schools, holistic education seems to be quite a niche phrase, but what does holistic education truly entail? When we look at climate justice, when we look at agroecology, are those not issues that are so pertinent to holistic education? And, the one thing that really, really scares me is this 12 generational thing. But how do we truly, and I think I've said it the last time we were together, but I do believe that when you have a blank canvas, if you truly want to change and reshape thinking, you've got to catch children at their most impressionable ages, and that would, it's linked to holistic education. It's starting from the bottom, where this way of thinking and lifestyle is not just something that forms a little part of a curriculum, but it becomes the norm. It's like brushing your teeth. It's something that we just do, without thinking. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay.
So as usual, I'm sorry, I'm going to be kind of raining on the parade of people and being a bit pessimistic. I'm going to take it from the ground below and up to a regional point. So the first thing is that when we talk about agroecology, when we talk about being part of nature and nature itself, practice is key, and practice takes time. Practice entails a lot of mistake, and we don't usually factor that in when we talk about finances. And it also means practice in terms of sharing knowledge on a regional basis. A lot of the practices that we have in terms of protocols can be shared, but South Africa leads in the region in sharing really pervasive practices in businesses, you know, these corporate tribunals, pesticide, how to find ways to kind of build really corporations around destroying seed banks that have existed for hundreds of years. We're talking about lots of the other countries in the region, Madagascar, Mauritius, because I know we can see the work of Miriam Mayet and ACB around that. So when we say we want to build something, we're going to be building it within several crises. Nature, for sure, that is changing, but also it's going to be not going to be a blank canvas. We are a culture. We have grown within a certain culture, and we're going to make mistakes, and we need to factor that in. And we also need to think that there's going to be a fight back. And this is also something important. We need to allow ourselves to make mistake within this plan that you thought about for several generations. We are going to make mistakes, and we will have to pick ourselves up. So that was what I was going to say about practice and our capacity to move towards something that is really nature or financially viable.
Thank you. We got it. How many more hands? Okay, because we got. Yes, keep it short, sharp. And I know, Pressend, you had your hand up too, right? So maybe next.
Yeah, thank you very much for, you actually suggesting a very concise and deep transformative framework. But my question also links to what, sorry, my comrade there just asked. I mean, in this, did you have the chance, or are you also planning to look at, because when we speak about the climate justice block of class and popular forces, I'm sure you are aware about the heterogeneity of the climate justice already movement, and I mean the popular forces that you mean. So these groups are highly heterogeneous, although we're fighting around the same issue, but I'm sure internal struggles or disagreements might also affect. And which do you anticipate any internal issues in your proposed block? That's one. The other question also speaks to responses from capital, because South African economy is very, very well integrated into the global system. So they will have counter forces emerging, not only from South Africa, although the project, your initial framework speaks about South Africa, but going ahead, it's to be a regional or a global idea. But how do you anticipate responses to that, and how do you think they could be addressed properly? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Fish, for this presentation. It was a really great one. My question is, what is the accountability in the age of transition? Like, who gains and who loses while communities are still living in unjust transitions? And can you also go deeper? You spoke of the theory of change around that. Go deep on epistemological crisis state. You said we're in the that's the academic term. So if you can just explain a bit more,
Sure.
what do you mean that we're in the epistemological crisis state, and also the green state? There's a lot that is happening around just transition and the green. Is this just transition really green? We've got people will want to create electric cars while we have critical raw materials that can't be out there. We know green hydrogen, it uses 20 gallons of water, while we have communities who are still struggling, who do not have water. Have people want to do the same electric cars, while we know that lithium batteries, they are actually critical raw materials. So yeah, that's right.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, final one. Yes, Janet.
Thanks, Vish. Vish, you glossed over something which had my ears pricking up, and I'd just like, I mean, this is probably 2 days worth of response from you, but
Okay.
you said Africa resources need to be collectivized. You spoke about Pan-Africanism and the need for a deal to be placed with the rest of the world, and you highlighted cobalt, for instance. Wouldn't mind a little drill down on that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, right. So right now, cobalt, I'll start with the last question, is leading to massive displacement in the Congo. Many, many people are dying, and so on. And basically, you know, this kind of scramble for Africa is still ongoing, basically. Africa is a defeated continent. From 1980 onwards, it's become very, very clear that the post-colonial moment didn't produce victory for us. The World Bank, the IMF, the WTO later on, have all wrenched open Africa in the context of US-led neoliberal governance. So it's an imperialism that has disciplined us, that has corrupted our elites. So we actually have lumpen elites on our continent, largely. They're bought out by these mining corporations, they're bought out by powerful transnational interests, etc. And so for me, the cobalt issue and extractivism generally around the continent is something we can confront by renewing radical Pan-Africanism. It's going to be hard work. But there are forces on the continent that are rising that are saying enough is enough. There are communities that are fighting. There's women in over 16 countries working with mining affected communities. There's the Food Sovereignty Alliance on the continent in over 33 countries, etc. There's a whole host of progressive forces on this continent that can renew a new project, okay, which tackles extractivism, particularly fossil fuels, which we don't want, but at the same time, the materials and minerals that the global north sees as strategic for their transition, we need to have collective control over it, okay? It can become a very powerful bargaining lever and so on. So that's the first point. Your point very quickly around the green state, electric cars, it relates to this issue as well. So we don't have enough minerals on the planet, basically, for an American style transition, okay? With their conception of green being every household have a car, every household have all the green gadgets you can imagine, etc., etc. It will consume all the resources we have. That conception of the transition relates to how we should rethink, for example, eco-mobility systems, my comrade from Snake Park. Eco-mobility systems that are public, clean energy. So instead of us having everyone owning one individual car, knowing the limits of resources, we work towards these collective transport systems. That's key, okay? So the green state will promote one eco car for every person and so on and so on. Whereas we would argue, no, as part of a climate emergency state, let's build eco-mobility systems across this country that are clean energy, that are minimal extraction, etc., etc. Okay. The epistemological crisis relates to the fact that the state is stuck in South Africa. It's stuck in neoliberal orthodoxy. So the way it understands economics, and Siraj is here, and he's at the coalface of fighting those fights in Parliament. They are not capable of leaving behind a framework that has not worked for 3 decades, that has brought more pain and suffering to the people in this country. Okay, so austerity, squeezing households, squeezing society. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. They still believe that the poor, the workers in this country must carry the costs of whatever policy choices they make. That's what it amounts to simply. Okay, that's what I mean by they have no imagination. They can't think beyond that framework. And given the polycrisis and the depth of the crisis, that framework has failed us. That framework is implicated in causing the polycrisis as well. I think that's my point. I hope that's clear. Just on the question of theory of transformation, we'll talk more about it tomorrow in the activist school. Okay. So, I mean, I'm not going to respond to everything, but I just want to do justice to the great comments received from comrades. So this issue about the capital's response. See, I really think that capital is, while it might seem like it's on the offensive and so on, what we're seeing in the US, etc., and it's clearly showing its appetites for kind of unimaginable greed. Okay, this is capitalism going off the rails. If you ask me, it's devouring itself. That is the apparent contradiction here. It's devouring itself, and it wants to devour all of us too. Okay, and so in that process, as it engenders this worsening polycrisis dynamic, which it cannot solve because it just wants more of the dominant logic, it's going to open up spaces. So this relates to my point about us facing a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in planetary temperature in the region and in the country. I think we can make the case for survival. And that's why I'm writing this chapter. We can make the case to break with that logic and defend our lives, okay, and the lives of other more than human life forms. And it's that argument versus capital. For me, that's imperative, okay? And I think that argument is very, very powerful. It's an intergenerational justice argument. It's an argument that can mobilize society. So this is not some ultra left, we're going to smash the state. No, we're going to do what is necessary to survive. Okay, and I think that's a very powerful wedge against capital. Okay, to neutralize capital, to split capital, and even to tame capital. Okay, I also think that the point you're making about mass politics is a crucial one. Now, I think many of us that are standing on that climate justice terrain of politics clearly understand that there's all kinds of currents in it. There's that narrow liberal current that believes you can just lobby the state and then all's well, okay? There is that crowd politics current. That means you can activate a mass through social media and you bring them to one place and you've won the struggle. No, that is not about movement building. Those two modes of politics are a problem, okay? Because we're dealing with such a serious crisis, such a dangerous problem, we have to build mass politics. Okay, and I think this is where we're going to have the hard conversations in this movement process, in this movement building process. Where are we directing our energies? Where are we directing our resources? Are we aggregating to have an efficacious, politically strategic and powerful movement? That's what it's coming down to. Okay, and now if you look at history, that's the lesson. Whether you're fighting slavery, whether you're fighting colonialism, whether you're fighting apartheid, whether you're trying to tame capitalism in the global north after World War II, you had mass working class movements. That's the bottom line. If climate justice activists do not make that breakthrough, where they recognize we have to have a strategic politics, not a crowd politics with mobs and stealing headlines and then, or just lobbying a failing state. If climate justice forces make that breakthrough in their activism, I think we can go somewhere. But that's a challenge. That's a big challenge. I do think that, I mean, your point about activism, praxis, self-reflexive mistakes, I think we accept that. I mean, for many of us who've been activists for a long time, we know we will never be perfect. And you will always learn from what you do. Okay, you'll get it wrong. You will make mistakes. That's a good thing, actually. And I think for us, where we are coming from with our traditions of mass politics in this country, that's definitely part of who we are. I think this point about education is absolutely crucial. And I think that's why, for me, this conception of the state where all its institutions, including, I said, knowledge-producing institutions, has to mainstream the climate emergency. So your point about agroecology in schools, empowering the next generation to understand now this new world we're going into, this new planet we're living on, is absolutely crucial. I mean, that's the battle even at this university. The students here, we need to shift this institution to become a climate justice institution. This university has immense symbolic power in society. Some of us have already started pushing it and pushing it. We need to push it further so it becomes a climate justice leader. We need to start mainstreaming the climate emergency in research agendas. We need to start mainstreaming it in curriculum. We need to start mainstreaming it in institutional transformation. That needs to happen also in schools. And that means all other institutions that make up the state. Our local governments should be climate justice local governments. They should be working hand in glove with communities to accelerate the deep just transition. Okay, but that's our politics. We need to get there. Okay, I think the point about the Zondo Commission. So I had my own misgivings about it because we knew enough about corruption in the society through the Auditor General's reports. We could see so many government departments, agencies, year in, year out, qualified audits, red flags, etc. The corruption was writ large, okay? Investigative journalism also kind of connected the dots for us on numerous occasions, okay? The Zondo Commission comes in because Thuli Madonsela called for it, okay? And as taxpayers, we paid for it. It's told us a lot of what we know, but I do think for democratic politics, it was a good thing, okay? And we need to take away from it, though, the conclusions. This is what's lacking. I don't understand why President Ramaphosa has not tabled the political outcomes of the Zondo Commission in his party, for example, and made it known to the public. Or the cabinet has said, these are now the recommendations we are taking forward publicly, okay? I mean, they owe it to us because we paid for this damn report, okay? And part of the challenge we're facing as a society is that there's no consequences for corruption. No consequences. You get rewarded, you get sent to parliament, you get in a cabinet portfolio, etc., etc. I got to wrap up, okay? But the fact of the matter is, we need to break with this impunity, and we need to build a culture of accountability, a culture of trust, and a culture of serving society. That's where we need to go. And we need to have zero tolerance for corruption. Even in our own ranks as activists, we got to display the highest ethical standards when it comes to resources, what we are doing, and remake the moral order of our society. Siraj, I look forward to your paper. I'm not going to, that you guys wrote. I mean, and finally, just to say that, Michelle, I've been writing on the state for a long time in the post-apartheid period. And I've been looking at the remaking of the state and its state formation for a long time. So what I'm doing here is summarizing it, basically. But the crux of this argument is that we have a polycrisis and we have a state that's incapable of rising to that challenge. One element of that polycrisis brings a serious existential risk to us. We cannot just embrace ideas that are not going to meet this challenge. And we need a new imaginary. We need a new concept. We need a whole new approach to the state. Thank you. Let's have tea. Let's come back at 12 o'clock, and then we'll have a final hour together to bring this all together. We'll do a collective assessment. Thank you. So we're now going to bring this all to a close, and we're going to do this in a way that enhances our work. And all right. that takes this project to conclusion. Okay, so, all right. So the past day and a half has been very, very stimulating. We've been trying to figure out this question of the state and locating that question in the context of the polycrisis. So I'm just going to share a set of observations about our conversation around the contributions made. And then I'm going to talk about process and how we're going to bring this all together. I am going to then also invite you to share your reflections and kind of buzz around that. And then a vote of thanks. So in terms of common ground, it's very clear that in this volume, we share as a premise this idea of the polycrisis. It's a word that has been thrown around by the World Economic Forum in 2023, but this polycrisis is older than that. It starts in the mid-2000s, okay? It is the fourth great crisis of capitalism, and it is bringing forth catastrophe, which is very, very different from the crisis of the 70s, which is very, very different of the interwar year crisis and the late 19th century crisis. It is also about social ecological reproduction challenges. In other words, it is gridlocking life making. This crisis is preventing us from surviving. That's the point about this crisis, very simply. So hunger, yeah? You can't survive, you can't feed yourself. You can't get a job, wage earning, biodiversity loss. And in many communities, people still depend on biodiversity. They depend on the commons and so on. So life making is being gridlocked. But this polycrisis is also about politics in crisis. It's also about imperialism in crisis. And essentially, we're dealing with the crisis of capitalist civilization. That's what we're dealing with, okay? So this whole world system is in a deep, deep crisis. So that's the first common ground or premise of this volume. The second is that we are bold enough on this journey to embrace complexity science as a means to understand this polycrisis. With complexity science, which comes out of the natural sciences, we as social scientists are saying it has something to offer us, okay? It helps us turn our back on reductionist thinking, where you reduce complex problems to a part, to one element, and so on. It helps us confront and turn our back on duality thinking, or, if you like, the state, the nature human binary, okay? So complexity science basically prompts us to think more deeply about our life worlds, okay? And states are ill-equipped to understand the interconnections and dynamics of polycrisis and the need for root causes to be tackled because they are stuck in reductionist science. They are stuck in this nature society binary. They're all about the conquest of nature, okay? At the same time, with this emphasis in the state around conquering nature, we have to think about, with complexity science, how we fundamentally transform the state to go beyond green modernization, to end the war with nature, and recognize humans are just one part, a decentered part of a complex, fragile web of life, okay? So that's the second common ground, bringing in this complexity perspective, which relates to how we think crisis, how we think the systems that are there, the socio-ecological systems, the feedback loops that come with that, the reverberations and cascades of this crisis, and so on. We also share common ground on the polycrisis of the state. So this is not just a polycrisis happening around the state, with the state hovering above this polycrisis. No, The state is implicated in the polycrisis, and it is in polycrisis itself. And this is a very crucial contribution of this volume. Right now, there's 2 books, because I've looked at the literature before this workshop. I've mentioned Wolfgang Streeck's book on the top list of Financial Times reads, but there is another book as well, a Marxist attempt to think about the state in this current context, but not using a polycrisis perspective. So how is the state imbricated in this polycrisis? How does it cause polycrisis? And how we go deeper around the state polycrisis nexus is definitely common ground in this book. Okay. The 4th bit of common ground in this book is the transformative role of the state. So none of us are giving up on the state, but we don't think the state by itself can solve this polycrisis. And therefore, our horizons of thinking, our imaginary on the state, takes us towards the deep democracy state, which means that it's an embedded state, it's a relational state in relation to civil society. So all of us constitute the state, and all of us can redirect and reshape that state. It also means that we want a decolonial state, okay? So we don't want a state that's going to continue the conquest of nature, racializing logics, patriarchy, and so on. We also want an emancipatory ecology state. This is very, very important. This is contra-domination ecology. We want a state that's committed to ending the war with nature, okay? And we are in a world historical moment where this argument has to be made. We cannot have a state that is ruining our ecological foundations that we need for life making. So that's the common ground in this volume. The second point I want to make is that, and this was part of my introduction, is that this is where new approaches to Marxist state theory are. And from the contributions that were made by different people, there is some resonance around these approaches. So we're not walking strictly in each one of these paths of thinking, of inquiry, but there is some overlap with some of the debates that we've been having, okay? So including this idea of the Eurocentric state, et cetera, et cetera. So there is some resonance of contemporary Marxist thought with the journey that we are on. The other point I'll make is that from the presentations, many of the chapters are rising to this challenge. So this is how I specified it in the opening. We are thinking about the state as a relational state with relative autonomy. So it can discipline capital if the relations of power that prevail in and on the state push it in that direction. It is a state that is a site of contestation, okay? So using that as a starting point or a concept, we've risen to the tasks that we set for ourselves. Many of the chapters spoke about various institutions in the state, okay? And the field of struggle, how these institutions connect with institutions of capital, of society, etc. A lot of the chapters spoke about empirical inquiry and linkages connecting the state with class and popular actors, talking about ideologies in the state, whether it's unjust transitions, whether it's reductionist approaches to water, and so on and so on. So again, we are not approaching this question of the state abstractly. We are using the best of social science to help us think critically about where the state is at. We're also thinking with how state functions to promote capital accumulation is happening. Okay, so you got this polycrisis, but the state is still not veering from that path. The interest to capital, the risk to capital is what comes first. But there are also strategies of rule that we have been kind of bringing to the foreground, de-risking, etc. We've looked at attempts to legitimize the state is in a deep legitimacy crisis, okay? And of course, how the state engenders polycrisis. So many of the chapters take this on board. And then, of course, how should the state transition to contribute to overcoming polycrisis? There's 3 chapters in this volume that do this explicitly, okay? Thomas Isaac's chapter is about the deep democracy state in Kerala, how it confronted COVID, and of course, what comes after. And it's a point I'll make just now. Michael Albert's chapter is about transitioning the UK state. Where do you want to take it? And my own chapter is about transitioning the South African state to a democratic climate emergency state, okay? And then, of course, what class and popular strategies can transform states as part of deep, just transitions? So notions of deep democracy have come through, notions of local economies that are transformative logics, water commoning, exits for countries in the periphery of capital from the finance manager complex, and so on. So there's a lot of kind of strategies around repositioning the state. And this makes this, again, a very exciting volume. It doesn't end up in a pessimistic place. This is a volume to guide praxis. This is what this entire series has been about, okay? Now, just very quickly, to just talk quickly to some of the chapters and give some specific comments. I'm going to send this out also to the contributors. So Thomas Isaac's chapter, as I said, was about Kerala's deep democracy state, where civil society can sit on the board of a hospital and shape the direction of that hospital. Social forces in villages can shape how the budget is used for that village, and so on, and so on, and so on. But the point about that chapter is that while it gave us very important analysis and understanding of how this deep democracy state responded to COVID-19, and clearly its response was way more efficacious than the Indian central state. But I think what this chapter needs to do, though, is draw out the lessons for governing the polycrisis. What does this deep democracy case study of Kerala help us to think about governing the polycrisis, okay? And this, by the way, is in keeping with complexity thinking, because deep democracy means that the state doesn't have all the answers. Deep democracy means that people own problems, people solve problems, okay? So when there's more shocks coming, there's more disruptions in society's socio-ecological systems, a deep democracy state has more capacity to deal with this. This is very, very important. So I want to push Isaac to kind of go in that direction. So not just stop with COVID-19. Zora posed a very, very important question to us as she kind of elaborated complexity thinking and the limits of the state in terms of having that kind of approach, okay? Do we need the state was her question. It's a powerful question. It's a poignant question. Now, I think we've reminded her that the right wing has an answer to that question, right? And the right wing wants, if you like, a hollowed out state. And that's been happening through 4 decades of neoliberalization. And we're probably going to see with this plutocratic neo-fascist Trump regime, another wave of hollowing out that's probably going to take things in a very extreme direction. So again, I think collectively we're inviting Zora to think about, well, it's not just a left answer to this question, the right has an answer as well. So how do you navigate this? Siraj, I think, helped us understand the polycrisis and locating the financial crash and how money manager capitalism benefited, how it influenced and shaped the most powerful state in the world, the United States, its reserve, and so on, in the midst of that financial crash. And I think he's also in his notes gestured towards how this finance manager capitalism, money manager capitalism constrains the state in the global south. The moment you lock into that game, you are constrained in terms of policy and what you can and can't do, okay? And the South African state is a quintessential example of that, and many others. But I do think that Siraj is also helping us understand a particular form of capture. And I think that could be something that you make more explicit. But also, I think the point of exits came out. And I think we engaged in the deliberation, but just to underline it, how do we exit from this money manager capitalism? What are the options? What is the space that we can create, and so on? So again, I think wanting and inviting the chapter contributors to think about using this kind of big structural analysis, but also helping us think about where we can go is very, very important. Michelle, I think your chapter around de-democratization and particularly sort of the de-democratization in the global South, we never had genuine democracies in the global South. I think that's a core part of our argument. But I think what we have to explicitly articulate in your paper is that the de-democratizing rationality is now there in the global North. And I think you kind of alluding to that, but that is where we are now. You mentioned the security complex state, et cetera, et cetera. So that de-democratizing logic is impacting the global South, it's impacting the global North. And maybe, and maybe not, because I think the way you framed your argument, you're helping us think in sort of broad global terms, the global trends, but you might want to consider the US as a case study, maybe not, but the elements are there. That's a classic case of the leading liberal democracy, the standard of civilization, de-democratizing in a horrific way, okay? And maybe we want to bring that to the fore. But again, these are all just proposals for people to think about. Pressend, we've had some conversation, but I think what stands out in your chapter is that Mozambique is experiencing the climate polycrisis, actually. And your opening introduction was very powerful, with the number of cyclones that battered Mozambique, the number of floods, the loss to GDP, the ballooning debt, etc. So I'm saying that that should be the kind of main framing, the climate polycrisis and the Mozambican state. Cyclone Idai and just transition challenges. So, you can bring in this kind of weak carbon democracy. You can point out how it's implicated also through fossil fuel extraction in fueling the climate metabolic rift. But I think where you really need to go is your case study on Cyclone Idai, and to show how the state's disaster risk management approach came short. It was reactive, okay? And basically, it wasn't informed by a just transition perspective. Whereas the social forces that stepped onto the terrain of catastrophe, the different movements, UNAC, etc., were all about seeding. They were about immediate relief, but they were also about seeding a deep just transition out of that moment. And I think that that's very powerful. And what they were trying to do is gesture the state to move in that direction. But clearly the state hasn't moved in that direction. So, this is where the challenges for that just transition or deep just transition need to be specified more. So I think that can be and will be an amazing chapter. One of the poorest countries in the world, really getting pummeled by the climate crisis, and some of its social forces trying to find a new way forward, and what we can learn from that and the limits and challenges. Alfredo is going to write a chapter on the polycrisis of the Brazilian state, but some of the sentiment and comment I've made here, I'll also share with him. I'll be sharing these notes with him and all other contributors. Asha, your chapter was interesting in that, historians use this term longue durée, it's 2 centuries or more. So you've done a longue durée analysis of biological disasters and social breakdown in Mauritius. My only worry with that is that there's a lot there. So you're going to have to think about selecting, framing a narrative around that past, and maybe selecting 2 of those key cases that sets the template for the Mauritian state, basically, to have what I think you were arguing, an elitist and ruling class centered response to biological disasters and social breakdown. So that's my first point to you. But the other point is connecting that to the contemporary polycrisis. Okay, so Mauritius as an island state is facing serious climate risks and challenges, sea level rise being one of them. I don't know whether cyclones are a real risk to you and others. So maybe saying, you know, this is the past, this is the mold of the state, an elitist state and so on. It does have protocols, etc., to protect society. These are its limits, and in the context of the current polycrisis. And I think if you can bring that together in 6,000 words with references, that would be amazing. We will all clap for you. Jackie, I think your chapter also has a great contribution to make to the volume. I think it's important to specify the points of departure for your argument, and I think you were doing that. But it doesn't have to be a long list. You know, it's the limits of neoliberal market democracy. Boom. It's the rise of neo-fascism. Boom. You know, and that's what's happening even in the global north. So some cross-referencing is going to be very crucial. So with yours and Michelle's chapter and so on. But I do think that you also got to think about African responses around the state. And in my mind, there were three key moments. One was in the immediate post-colonial aftermath, and I think Awande alluded to, you know, Ujamaa and some of the kind of villagization that happened in Mozambique and other places. To think about that as one moment of trying to rethink the state in Africa. The other moment is the decolonization or the end of apartheid and the Southern African transition, Mozambique, Angola, ourselves. That's the second moment. And there was a very serious debate amongst leading African intellectuals, Claude Ake, Samir Amin, Issa Shivji, around what kind of constitutionalism should come to the fore. And they were arguing for radical democracy, not narrow liberal democracy. So there was a second moment there. And then there's that third moment where you're alluding to a philosopher or someone who's talking about African conceptions. Yeah, I mean, I think that's my comment to you. I mean, I think the South Africa case study, the way you explained it and set it out is an example of maybe a failure to have a serious African decolonial response. Okay. Michael, I think the key point for me with him was the care economy idea and industrial policy, and that point was made. But generally, I think his argument is solid, it's clear, it's crisp, and so on. Michelle Pressend, again, your paper is an amazing one, and it's going to make a crucial contribution. That 6,000 word limit is important. But perpetuating cheap electricity through kind of bringing back coal-fired power stations, locking in the working class, the coal working class, etc. This is also about the unjust transition. So this is about how resource nationalism and class interests are shaping this unjust transition. So if you could kind of gesture to that, I think would be important. How the paradox or paradoxes exacerbate the polycrisis would be important to make a link to, okay? So if they're continuing this coal-fired paradox while talking renewables and an unjust transition, as you know, climate change intensifies. You also made the point about extractivism. Extractivism intensifies on both legs, actually, coal and for a particular kind of ecological modernization approach to renewables and so on. So connecting that up to polycrisis would be key. And I think the points made by Michelle were also very, very important around the case study to overcome the paradox. But ultimately, I think the role of the state and relational energy dynamics is something you're going to have to think about. Even in those alternatives, where does the state sit in terms of your alternative pathways, I think is important, okay? Again, I think, you know, this deep democracy state we're working with and climate emergency, democratic climate emergency state we're working with, I think from your case studies from below, you help us see it in the making. I think that's what's powerful about it, you know. Ferrial, I mean, I think Ferrial's chapter also overlaps with Zora's chapter around complexity. And I think for Ferrial, it's important that she upfront unpacks that polycrisis of water. So it's not one single problem. It's not a one-dimensional issue, the water crisis. It's many things. Okay, lack of investment in reservoirs, leaking pipes, corruption, procurement issues, crisis of leadership in the state, et cetera, et cetera. It's a polycrisis of water, but it's being responded to in a technocratic way, okay, in a reductionist way. And it's failing to understand the complexity of water systems as socio-ecological systems, okay? So I think that's a point she can elaborate. I think the other point is that shift from cheap water to commodity. She is trying to do that work, and I think it's important. I think she needs to talk about the anti-water commons practices of the state more explicitly, okay? And then kind of transition into the water commons public partnership. So there's so many anti-water commons tactics, interventions by the state that are constantly undermining the agency of communities, the responses of communities, et cetera, et cetera. And then I had a lot of comments from all of you, which I am going to reflect on. In terms of where we're taking this, I think we organized our conversation around 3 themes in this workshop, okay? The polycrisis of the state, the polycrisis of the state in the global south, and the polycrisis of the state in South Africa. I actually think there's got to be a bit of reordering of that. So for example, the transitioning of the polycrisis state needs to be a theme. So those 3 chapters, Thomas Isaac's, Michael Albert's, mine, form one thematic, I think. And then, of course, we can see how we rework and position some of the other chapters. But that will come out of revisions. I want to thank all of you for your willingness to engage in critical debate. So whenever we run this workshop, it's not about egos, it's about learning from each other. And so all the comments, all the suggestions, all the proposals are about clarification. It's about sharpening our thinking. So this workshop process, in my view, has helped us focus. It's helped us think the tight fit, because we do want to achieve certain things with this volume. It's helping us think cross-referencing across chapters. And I think it's becoming more and more clear that a lot of these chapters are talking to each other, and cross-referencing is important. And most importantly, this dialogue is helping us give coherence to the kind of thinking we're doing. We will share the resources from contributors. Thomas Isaac has sent his PDF, his slides, and so on. Others, please send your slides as well to me and Charles, and we will send that out to everybody that wants to have these resources. In terms of timelines, comrades and contributors, dearest contributors, so the drafts have already started coming in. Michael Albert sent me his draft last night. So the process going forward as a first step is you got to start sending me your drafts for feedback from now till the end of March. So the sooner you get it to me, I will engage with you around some of these comments, around our approach, and we'll take it over the finishing line as a draft. So that's the first iteration of engagement after this workshop. The second step is the final deadline of end of April. Okay, so end of April, all revisions done. I use that month of April to kind of mop up any final changes with you, and we get it to Wits Press. Remember, this is a series. I have a long relationship with Wits Press, the leading academic press in this country. They have planned this into their production cycle now as a volume, all right? So I've got to stick to these deadlines very, very seriously. There will be peer review. Wits Press peer reviews everything, and the peer reviews are rigorous. Sometimes 3 reviewers, sometimes 2, but a minimum of 2. So there'll be a moment, a third step of revisions. I don't see this volume falling short. I think there's a high level of thinking here, there's rigor here, there's coherent arguments, there's a compelling perspective in this book. So I'm confident that the peer review will be like the other 8 volumes, where people go like, wow, this is interesting, and they give us positive feedback, okay? And then 4, we then hand over to Wits Press as the 4th step. They take it into a production process at the latter half of 2025. That will mean, again, another round of page-proof revisions, etc. And then production by sometime in 2026. So this is their schedule, which I brought into this workshop that I've agreed to with them. And then, of course, the final step would be making this both hard copy available, but because these are resources for activism, I've raised the resources, thankfully, from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation to make this open source. So all the volumes in the Democratic Marxism series, all 9, will be downloadable, free for you to use in your activism, grow your consciousness, invest in yourself as an activist. So comrades, before the vote of thanks, I want to use the next half hour to do a collective assessment with you, to get your feedback on this workshop, this day and a half. What are the learnings you take back? What are the things that challenged you and forced you to rethink? What are the things that you're going to put to use? I know the bar was high, comrades. It was a bit of a baptism for some of you. But don't be afraid of knowledge, comrades. If you're going to step in front of your society, if you're going to step in front of your community to change the world, okay, be open to learning from all these spaces and so on. Be open to challenging yourself, because as conscious agents of change, we've got to have a deep consciousness. We've got to understand these challenges in a deep, serious way, okay? Slogans are not going to be enough. They're important, okay? Marching in the streets, absolutely important, but not enough, okay? We have got to advance a project for our societies. We've got to advance alternatives. We've got to be able to make the case for those alternatives. We have got to do our homework as activists. So I know every evening you've been doing homework and you came late, so you missed the homework, Nasinto. So you've been doing homework, but we will take this further over the next 2 days, where we will ground this solidly into our activism. So any hands, comments? Awande, and then after you, Christine. Awande, go.
Thank you. I think, yeah, the first thing is, I think this volume being the last volume is also quite timely and well placed amongst the other 8, in that we're in the moment of crisis, polycrisis, globally, locally, particularly in our state kind of context of post-election atmosphere of we're seeing another cycle of how it's going to be reconfigured. And to grapple with these crises, we have to ask ourselves, what is the kind of state that's going to be amenable or ready to deal with those crises? So that means we have to tackle the question of the state. There are no holy cows, and we have to be open if we seriously, fundamentally want to get to the roots of these. And I think the presentations over the past day and a half have spoken to that spirit. They've shown an openness, an intellectual openness in trying to truly kind of grapple with what it is. I think for me in particular, something which, if I can pick one, I think Zora's exploration on complexity really spoke to me, because the thing about crises is that they can be debilitating, and that there's a fight or flight response, right? You withdraw from it, or you freeze at the weight of how much has to be achieved and how much has to be confronted. So I think also us becoming comfortable with complexity as a concept, comfortable that there are no easy solutions, but there are and there is an interconnected way into which to approach these things, and that we must also have a complexity in our response. So I think, yeah, that was a really great point that came out for me.
Thank you, Awande. Christine, I think. Christine, comrade? Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think my take from all the presenters is I'm worried about their presentation talks about everything, and they doesn't specify, our targets. Are we, because I didn't hear any presenter talking about the disability, so I felt that we leaving behind one section of people that are part of our society. And are they really covered on the research, the disability, the kids, the women, the unemployed, the youth, because we are different and our impacts that we face affects us differently. So my worry is to those researchers and everything inclusive, to those sectors, that when we go with Zora's presentation, we'll say, okay, this one will fit for kids. Or when we go with someone's presentation, will fit for women, So yeah, that was my take, to say I'm worried about that, maybe because it was short time and everything cannot be outlined thoroughly. But yeah, thank you.
Your point is taken, and I think it's again an advisory to contributors. So when we're thinking the polycrisis, let's make those connections analytically with grassroots women, disabled, etc., etc. So valid point. Yes.
Yeah, no, thanks, Comrade Vish. Yeah, I think there was a lot to comprehend. And unfortunately, time was not on our side. So I think in terms of us having to contribute around the table or around the room, it was somehow limited. So I think probably going forward, it's better to do less with more time so that we get full participation. Especially, we are activists, but some of us are very comfortable in speaking in small groups. There's a wealth of knowledge around the room, but possibly some people never spoke because of maybe not having some sort of like an intimate sessions where 4 or 5 groups speak to themselves. So probably if maybe we had something of that, we would have actually had a lot from those individuals. And yeah, I think there's a lot. But then my worry is, this volume is very, very critical, for us and for, I mean, now then I ask myself, will government be able to comprehend all this, wealth of knowledge? And because this is a betterment of everyone, and will they be able to comprehend? Probably, I think also what needed to be looked at is how do we then prioritize the hierarchy of the information that is being addressed by this volume? Probably looking at the low-hanging fruit, and prioritizing that, considering that our government, we are led by people who are really not, open-minded. And then how do we make things easy for them, in terms of ranking looking at the low-hanging fruits and prioritizing, the list of topics within the hierarchy of the volume. Yeah, so yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Bongani. I just want to say, I'm a very strange academic. So I funded this workshop out of my research funds, but I was very, very clear, and I've always been clear about this, that this kind of intellectual work mustn't happen in the ivory tower. We must break that wall, okay? And I've always ensured in these workshops, we have activists. So for me, comrades, the conversation must continue after this. This is just breaking the ground, okay? It's stimulating you. So in our activist school tomorrow, let's go deeper. On Sunday, let's go deeper. But what's important about this volume for me is that it is equipping us intellectually as climate justice activists, okay? We can point to Kerala. We can point to Mauritius and its challenges. We can point to Mozambique and what happened there and what's happening there and what are the lessons and so on. But most importantly, this volume can help us make the case for our climate emergency social contract, okay? Now, this is a political proposition that's real. It's beyond this book. it's in our climate justice charter movement politics, okay? And so this volume is making the case to society, the state, and progressive forces in this country. But it is also helping us intellectually present serious perspectives on this, okay? So what I'm getting at is that this volume must live in struggle. It must live in climate justice struggle. I think that's what I'm getting at, okay? So it's a resource for us, and we can use it then to contest the state at any level, to educate them, to inform them, to let them know, no. Your conception of this corrupt, failing state, or this conception of some developmental state is not what we want. We want something else. Here's a perspective. It's in our documents, etc., etc. Someone else had a hand up, Daveen?
Thank you so much. I think my take from...
Oh, sorry, Sam. Yes, go ahead.
I think my take was, I think what came out in most of the presentations is a need to reimagine the idea of the nation state, you know. And I think we haven't really critiqued it enough, because it's always imagined as a kind of this huge thing that we should work towards, and particularly from South Africa, where democracy and the democratic state is seen as this radical rupture from the past. And so this reimagining, particularly from the green state paradigm, I think it offers a new proposition. So I think for me that is my take, and I'm interested to hear more on that, particularly in thinking democracy anew, because that's also another problem, that democracy and the post-apartheid South Africa or democracy has not offered the departure that we constantly look for. And so the critique of the state through the green state paradigm, I'm hoping that it can also take us to new ideas of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, Sam, maybe what you missed was this volume is a critique also of the green state as an option to deal with the polycrisis. But your points are well taken. And I think all the chapters need to take this on board, the rigor of our critique of the nation state, but also recognize that we are reaching for something else. That's what we're trying to do with this volume. We want a new paradigm, a new framework of the state that can help us solve the polycrisis. I think that's the problematic we're working with, but those points are valid. Yes, Daveen.
Yeah, I also want to agree with Comrade Bish, is that where we start as activists, we came from our area where we were very radical and militant, and using our power to fight systems. But sometimes we realize that fighting is sometimes the wrong time, or the wrong way to do things. Now I'm in local government. Now I see that the people that think they know everything doesn't know what's going on, and they can't handle, it's not they can't handle me, they can't handle my knowledge of the things happening, and how we can channel this thing to a certain way. So it's very important as manuals for us as the fighters in the systems, because we never go to universities. We were taught how through academia and sitting around the table like this, so we can go back, and because what we see that government take advantage of people in rural areas that don't know, because they just say, no, you didn't go to university, you are not educated, you are stupid, you stand up, you don't know for what, we need this and that, we can make a lot of money in this piece of land, but it's not the thing that we want. But through this, we can go back and we can show them this is a real thing. We can show them. So yes, there's a lot of people in positions in government that don't know what's going on, but they have this title of, I am the minister of this and I am this, and they don't know nothing. Thank you.
Set up a reading group in your local government, Daveen. Invite them to come sit in the reading group and use this text. Sorry, before you speak, comrade, Charles, ask people online if they just want to add a comment or something. Go ahead.
Just from my side, You know, I want to reiterate, and I've said it to some people, that it's such a huge privilege it has to have been part of this process. So to all of the academics, especially to you, Vish, because I know that you've put so much into it, thank you so much for all thinking of us and accommodating us. And like I've said earlier, I think for me, this has prompted more, you know, serious and in-depth thought processes. It has also spurred, you know, and it's wonderful to be able to go back to our communities and actually, you know, highlight, because I mean, there is an awareness, there's an emerging awareness already, but to highlight the urgency, you know, with regarding these crises. And sorry, I've written something down. Oh, and one thing that I take away from here is I'm seriously exploring the responsibilities that are incumbent upon me as a community activist, and how to further sort of, you know, in a pragmatic way, sort of further this, you know, further this course. And I look forward to further collaboration with our activists here present. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And comrades, in our activist school, we'll break down these ideas more. We'll break it down for what it means for your community struggle, for your struggle in your province, etc., etc. Okay. Anyone else? Final comments, reflections? Yes.
Yes, for me, it's what I will what I when I'm come when I come here from the first day coming from the rural area and representing Overberg in the Western Cape, and finding that there's so a lot of topics that we as community activists talked about and don't have any go-to persons or organizations, and challenges that we have and things that we some solutions I believe we have, and some these conversations come out of different massive challenges that we as ground hardworking activists face and work on. And I come here, I've got this invitation. For me, it was more than what you would think. Coming here and getting this information, getting some out of all this, of all our speakers, getting something to give me like this thing of, somebody is listening, somebody is hearing, somebody think of it, somebody is busy with something. So we're not facing nothing. We're not facing nothing. So there's some hope for us. So for me, I believe that representing the ground level hardworking activists and those communities, going back and saying, oh people, I think there is some voice, there is somebody or some organization that that will and look into what we are. We talk about it. So we're not sure where to go sometimes, and you're going to your municipality, the doors won't be closed, or you mustn't speak too much. And dear people, we have much challenges. And what I found this week is like there is really, I believe today there is hope for our communities in the environment, in the environmental sector, in the informal traders, in the community sector, social sector and stuff. So I say very thank you. Ek wil in Afrikaans sê baie dankie.
Baie dankie. Is there any final comments online? No, final comment here, then we're going to wrap up. Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, guys, all people who presented yesterday. Your studies, they really encourage us as activists. Recently, in Snake Park, we did a qualitative research study as activists, because now we have to have studies that are done by us on the field, on the ground. And I can say I was really impressed on your presentations but I think you lack storytelling. Yeah. The lady from Mauritius, she spoke of things that we want to see visually. If maybe she would have put in some pictures, you know, of what is really happening instead of just figures, and maybe quoted a story, a movement story of the activist in the ground or what. I don't know, maybe if she mentioned, but I got lost during her presentation because there were too much figures there. But her story is powerful. Next time, if maybe she could try to put on some, just a movement story, some pictures, storytelling, because there is a danger in a single story. So your work must change narratives as much as it must change us, but it must not be like, academics are boring. No, it must change, changing narratives and having an impact. But anyway, thank you so much for this, guys. And I hope this is not the last time we meet, maybe some other time. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for that. Okay, I think I'm going to share this vote of thanks with Michelle. She wants to say something after me, but is that what you said? I'll just do it and then you can give the concluding. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I just want to thank the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, whose board I chair, which has housed the Democratic Marxism series for over 12 years. I want to sincerely thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. They listened when I made the case for decommodifying these books, making them open access so ordinary people, activists, whoever needs to read this knowledge can get this knowledge. As I said, this entire series, which is very unique in the country, by the way, is open access. I want to thank the activists for comments in this workshop, but also in all the other 8 workshops we've had. We've had activists engaging like this, thinking with us, shaping the knowledge together, okay? This is collective intellectual practice, comrades. That's what's striking about this process for me. So it's not a hierarchy with us as academics there and activists somewhere else, etc. This knowledge is emancipatory knowledge. And this is knowledge that comes from your lived experience, your life world, but it also comes from the summits of the academy. And we're trying to figure out how we make this emancipatory knowledge together. And that's been the journey for over 10 years. I also want to thank contributors. So for this volume, all of you that have made the time, that are committed to this project of intellectual production, critical intellectual production. But I want to thank the activist scholars that I've invited over the 10 years to contribute. I want to thank the radical academics in South Africa and outside. When I came into the academy, I was a bit dismayed that there wasn't enough, in my view, critical thinking, particularly a Marxist framework. It was being walked back, it was being pushed back. And of course, identity politics, postmodernism, etc., was ruling the roost. And so for me, sustaining this journey has been about keeping another radical framework alive, which is not just about diagnosing the problem, but also providing alternatives. That's the critical thing about a decolonial, eco-feminist Marxism in dialogue with other anti-capitalisms. We never stop at the pessimism. We always reach for more. We look for the conscious hope, okay? And I want to also thank the next generation, many of you in this room, but also the younger academics, aspirant ones, the younger activists that have contributed to these volumes. I know that they've been marked by this, and I hope that these resources land with you. We have over 60,000 downloads of the Democratic Marxism series from all over the world, and I hope you take it into your activism, comrades. Amandla. Michelle, I don't know.
Okay, no, I said it yesterday, but I do want to end on a very, very warm and generous thank you to Vish, because you're all here and to the COPAC team. I mean, these guys are amazing, the amount of work they do. But to raise money, Vish is good at it. So you think it's easy. I've been with him for 20-something years, and I can tell you every cent he raises is excruciatingly difficult. And he raises money not for his own private research projects that would just let him fly high in the university. He raises it because he's committed to a shared knowledge project and to share what we think are some of the best cutting edge ideas as they're in the formation with people on the ground. So Vish has been doing this. I mean, he came, you know, he was an activist. He was a labor lawyer in a previous life. He was an activist. And he was always an intellectual, and he's continued that in this space. So, you know, I just want us to pause because I mentioned yesterday, this is a last DM, and it's been a painful decision for him. It's not the last of Vish, and it's not the last of Vish's thinking, but doing these volumes, especially doing these volumes in this sort of way, is extremely hard, exhausting, and, you know, and just it takes a tremendous amount of energy, effort, and commitment. So he wants to also be able to do some other stuff. I don't know any other academic, including myself, who has done as much for a public knowledge production as Vish. So I think we owe him an enormous vote of thanks and gratitude.
Celebrate.